Present.
Monsieur le Sénateur Pallet,
Present.
Monsieur le Sénateur Mezek,
Present.
Monsieur le Connétable de Saint-Hélier, Madame le Connétable de Saint-Laurent,
Present.
Madame le Connétable de Saint-Sauveur,
Present.
Monsieur le Connétable de Saint-Brelade,
Present.
Monsieur le Connétable de Grouville,
Present.
Monsieur le Connétable de la Trinité,
Present.
Monsieur le Connétable de Saint-Pierre,
Present.
Monsieur le Connétable de Sainte-Marie,
Present.
Monsieur le Connétable de Saint-Ouen,
Present.
Madame le Connétable de Saint-Martin,
Present.
Monsieur le Connétable de Saint-Jean,
Present.
Madame le Deputy Martin,
Present.
Monsieur le Deputy Southern, Madame le Deputy de Grouville,
Present.
Monsieur le Deputy Lewis,
Present.
Monsieur le Deputy Tadier, Monsieur le Deputy Higgins,
Present.
Monsieur le Deputy Masson,
Present.
Madame le Deputy Pinel,
Present.
Monsieur le Deputy de Saint-Martin,
Present.
Monsieur le Deputy de Saint-Ouen,
Present.
Madame le Deputy Dublé,
Present.
Monsieur le Deputy Labby, Monsieur le Deputy Wickenden,
Present.
Monsieur le Deputy de Sainte-Marie, Monsieur le Deputy Truscott,
Present.
Monsieur le Deputy Young,
Present.
Monsieur le Deputy Ash,
Present.
Monsieur le Deputy Morel,
Present.
Monsieur le Deputy Guida,
Present.
Monsieur le Deputy de Saint-Pierre, Monsieur le Deputy de la Trinité,
Present.
Monsieur le Deputy de Saint-Jean, Madame le Deputy Legre,
Present.
Monsieur le Deputy Aye, Madame le Deputy Pershaw, Monsieur le Deputy Ward,
Present.
Madame le Deputy Al,
Present.
Monsieur le Deputy Pamplin,
Present.
Madame la Deputy Gardner,
Present.
Monsieur le Doyen.
Notre aide soit au nom de Dieu qui a fait les cieux et la terre. Amen. Seigneur Dieu, Père éternel et tout-puissant, qui a établi le gouvernement et la puissance de la terre, pour le règlement et pour la conduite du peuple, et qui nous a commandé d'avoir toujours pour but la gloire de ton saint nom. Nous te prions qu'il te plaise de donner à cette assemblée le don de conseil et de prudence, d'unir les cœurs et les affections de tous ceux qui la composent, et de la conduire tellement toi-même par ton Saint-Esprit, que toute l'heure de réparation et ton accompagné de la bénédiction réussissent au bien-être et au soulagement du peuple, qu'il te plut de commettre à leur soin. Car nous t'en prions, au nom et par les mérites de ton Fils bien-aimé Jésus-Christ, notre Seigneur, qui nous a enseigné de t'invoquer en disant: Notre Père, qui est aux cieux, son nom soit sanctifié, ton règne vienne, ta volonté soit faite dans la terre comme au ciel. Donne-nous aujourd'hui notre pain quotidien, et nous pardonne nos offenses, comme nous pardonnons à ceux qui nous ont offensés. Et ne nous envoie pas en tentation, mais délivre-nous du mal. Car à toi la règne, la puissance et la gloire, au siècle des siècles. Amen.
Madame la Sénateur Ferguson,
Excusez.
Monsieur le Deputy Tadier,
Présent.
Monsieur le Deputy Labby,
Excusez.
Monsieur le Deputy de Saint-Jean,
Sir, the deputies has a medical appointment will join us shortly.
Excusez.
Monsieur le Deputy Aye,
Présent.
Madame le Deputy Pershad,
Excusez.
les états sont en nombre, Monsieur le Président.
Les États sont constitués. If we turn now to the order paper, the next item of public business is the housing affordability crisis, actions to be taken by the Government of Jersey, P31, lodged by Senator Mezek. The main respondent for this debate is the Minister for Housing Communities, and I ask the greffier to read the proposition.
The states are asked to decide whether they have opinion that there exists a housing affordability crisis in Jersey, and that in order to deal with this situation, A, legislation should be introduced to enhance security of tenure and tenants' rights to provide for open-ended tenancies as standard practice. B, rent stabilisation legislation and a rent commission or board to monitor and decide on annual rent increases should be introduced. C, the social housing rent setting should be reduced from charging rents of up to 90% of the market rate to charging up to 80% of the market rate. D, the annual financial return provided by Andiam Homes to the Treasury should be amended in the Government Plan 2022-25 to enable this change in rents policy without negatively impacting on their housing development programme. And D, the Council of Ministers is requested to produce a timetable for achieving these changes by no later than the end of July 2021.
Senator Mezek.
Thank you, sir. And I confess I'm still on a high after yesterday's decision by the Assembly to make some really good progress on improving the situation for rental housing for islanders out there. And I hope members will continue in the same vein this morning. And so the purpose of this proposition is to seek political approval to implement some of the recommendations from the Housing Policy Development Board, that being a report which was commissioned by the Chief Minister and put together and approved by a group of ministers and assistant ministers, non-executive states members from across the political spectrum, and lay members with experience in housing who consulted with stakeholders and experts in this field. The report is a comprehensive piece of work. It took 2 years to put together. It wasn't cheap, and it's not a copy and paste job from another jurisdiction. It's tailored specifically to the Jersey context and is the product of long discussions about the trade-offs that would need to be made to make it work here, so the package of proposals would be coherent. In relation to rental housing, they concluded that we ought to make open-ended tenancies standard practice to enhance security for both tenants and landlords, to introduce rent stabilisation to hold back the massive rise in rental inflation causing hardship in the private sector, and to restore social housing rents to a level which actually fits the definition of social housing. And those recommendations, combined with other recommendations covering other areas, constitute a true action plan for dealing with Jersey's housing affordability crisis. And so let's be clear, Jersey has a housing affordability crisis. You would have to have been living on the Minkies for the last decade to not realise this basic fact. It's obvious to our electorate, who tell us time and time again that it's a huge issue across classes in society. But let me tell members that every single young person knows it especially well, and it is a cause of the despair that so many of them feel about their futures in Jersey, as well as a cause for so many of our bright and talented young people leaving Jersey because they know their chances for affordable and stable housing are better elsewhere. But don't just go by anecdotal evidence. Statistics Jersey produces an objective house price index quarterly, which hits the headlines almost every time it's published, and the media broadcasts case studies of families who are struggling because it paints such a clear picture for how housing is becoming less and less affordable to ordinary working people. And in the report to this proposition, I've published the data that they have provided me, which shows that increases in the cost of rental accommodation are outstripping the increase in earnings year on year. The last income distribution survey demonstrated that the cost of housing was the single biggest cause of relative poverty in Jersey. And let's face it, it can only have gotten worse since then, especially when you look at further data published by Statistics Jersey and their real terms earnings measures and the rest of it. And I think it's because of these, because of an implied acceptance of these facts, that at the start of this political term of office, the Chief Minister himself directed that the Housing Policy Development Board would be set up and report as it has done. And on top of that, the government and Assembly ensured that adequate funding was put aside in the government plan to ensure that we had the resources to act upon the recommendations when they were arrived at. I ask with this proposition for the states to confirm that that work was not in vain and that we will not delay in taking the action renters in Jersey need to see their lives improve. But let's face it, the signs so far are not good. The Housing Policy Development Board report lay with the Chief Minister for 6 months before being published, and now 8 months later has still not had a formal response from the government as to whether they accept or reject those recommendations. And they've not even sought to host a briefing for states members to discuss and consider that report. I've asked on numerous occasions, both publicly and privately, whether the Chief Minister or government accepts or rejects the recommendations, and I've repeatedly been denied adequate answers. So in lodging this proposition, I've got the key recommendations to do with rental housing onto the agenda so that we can give our approval or otherwise to them and give an indication on whether we accept the work that has been comprehensively done or whether we want to tear it up and start all over again whilst the situation continues to deteriorate for islanders. And so on that note, we come to the Housing Action Plan, which was published on Friday. And I'm sorry to say that I think the plan is very underwhelming. And I'm sorry to say to members, it's a report which I think proposes delay and prevarication, betraying a sign that the government simply doesn't consider this issue important enough. It appears to be a charter for more talking, more reviews and more consultants, and doesn't contain a lot of action. The report itself, half of it is made up of very pretty pictures of Dandara homes and copied and pasted sections from other reports, not actually providing any new analysis about the housing situation beyond what's in the opening section of the Housing Policy Development Board report anyway. But when it does get to the action sections, there's not many actions at all in them. Instead, they constantly talk about reviewing this or that, or planning to create more plans. And they refer to reviews that are ongoing. They refer to new reviews. They refer to reviews to identify actions in areas that the Housing Policy Development Board has already reviewed. So it's a repeat review. In fact, I urge members to read it and actually see how many times the words initial review are used when referring to areas that have already been reviewed. So they're actually secondary reviews, not initial reviews. Apart from the one policy in it, which is to stop future share transfer sales, which I completely support, by the way, the document itself does not confirm an intention to effect any single clear policy proposal. None at all. It claims to build on the work of the Housing Policy Development Board, but it gives no indication on whether the clear policy proposals of that board are accepted and can be expected to form the basis of the work the Minister intends to carry out or not. In fact, it leaves it open for what the Minister's proposing to serve as little more than a repetition of work which has already taken place over a long time and at great expense. So my proposition simply asks the states to accept the work of the Housing Policy Development Board review and give the Minister a mandate to go ahead with the implementation of it. In fact, sir, I actually can't see how my proposition does anything at all to inhibit the work that the Minister says he wants to take. This proposition is helpful to him because it clarifies that the work he will go on to do will be based on the comprehensive work that took place before. So the Minister says he wants to produce a fair rent plan. Great. But the Housing Policy Development Board has already formed the basis of that work for him, and the Minister would do better to focus on the implementation of it. Fair rents is the introduction of European-style rent stabilisation and a cut in social housing rents to more affordable levels. That is what fair is, and it's what's proven to work in other jurisdictions. But the minister is asking us to reject a proposition, to accept the work he says he wants to build on, and he hasn't told us specifically that he rejects those recommendations from the Housing Policy Development Board. So I'm sorry, but his position simply doesn't make sense. And I urge the minister in this debate to tell us if he believes that rent stabilisation and cutting social housing rents are the wrong policies. And if he does say that, then we know where we stand. But if he says that those proposals are sensible, then we can accept this proposition and he can go on ahead with it with our approval. If members were in the briefing on the housing plan on Monday morning, they will have heard, I'm sorry to say, the minister unable really to give a coherent explanation as to why he opposes the state's proposition, which merely asks him to accept recommendations in a report which he's supposedly building on. If he accepts those recommendations, then this proposition is helpful to him because it gives him the mandate up front, rather than risk him putting in all of this work, time and effort, and bringing it to the Assembly only for us to reject it. So I urge members, if they trust the work that the Housing Policy Development Board did, and if the recommendations it came up with sound credible to you, then vote for this proposition and say loudly and clearly to the public that we hear what they're saying about the cost of housing in Jersey. We declare that it is a crisis, and we're going to take and agree to real action to deal with it and set the government off to implement it without delay, so that the public can start feeling the benefit of it sooner rather than later. So what I've just talked about there is about the politics of the situation. So for the latter part of my speech, I want to focus on the policies itself and why they are the right thing to do and should be accepted. And I hope members will have had the opportunity to read the Housing Policy Development Board report, although I will totally understand if they haven't been able to do so. There has been very little publicity surrounding from it, and the government has not hosted a briefing for members on it, which I think is really disappointing. But the report is clear, and I hope that my summary of the proposals in the report to this proposition are quite clear. Parts A and B of this proposition go together. They're aimed at improving security of tenure for private sector tenants and preventing unjustifiable rent increases, providing long-term certainty to tenants and landlords. It's to acknowledge that Jersey's European levels of private renting are met with European style tenancy rules that make that sort of housing ratio between rental and home ownership work properly. It takes inspiration from what's in place and which demonstrably works in other places. Austria, I've always found to be quite a good example in this area. So Part A asks us to introduce open-ended tenancies as standard practice. And this basically means that rather than tenancies normally lasting for a short period of time, where they can be unilaterally ended by one side for no reason, it's assumed that they would normally continue indefinitely, unless, of course, the tenant breaks the rules or doesn't pay their rent, or in fact, in specified circumstances where the landlord will have the right to retake possession of the home. But I'm specifically saying standard practice, because there will continue to need to be non-standard practices, because there are always going to be situations where there's a need for an option for short hold tenancies to suit certain circumstances. So I say to members, in accepting this part of the proposition, you're not creating an issue here. The minister will be required to come back and outline how this will work in practice, having looked at the options and consulted with stakeholders, including landlords. So you're not dictating that every tenancy forevermore becomes an open-ended tenancy that nobody can ever get out of. That's not the case. It just makes it standard practice that when you sign up for a tenancy, you're expecting you will have the opportunity to build yourself a stable life in that home without facing no-fault evictions and without facing unfair rental practices. So, sir, this part in particular is good for families, especially families with children, to give those children continuity as they grow up and turn a rental property into a home. It goes hand in hand, I think, with part B of the proposition, which asks us to introduce rent stabilisation. Let's be clear, sir, that is rent stabilisation. It's not rent control or rent caps. So I see Deputy Morell has asked for a point of clarification, so I'm happy to take that now.
Yes, Deputy Morell.
Thank you, and thank you, Senator. It's kind of you to offer the opportunity now. It was purely I didn't quite understand what the Senator was saying about the open-ended tenancies and the ability to still have shorter-term tenancies, and why having open-ended tenancies doesn't stop shorter tenancies being available. I'd be really grateful if you could just clarify what he meant there, because I don't see how the two are compatible. Thank you.
Thank you. Also, they will be compatible. There are obviously going to be circumstances where an open-ended tenancy is not appropriate. So one example could be that somebody owns a home in Jersey that they live in, but they're, for employment reasons, going to leave the island for a few years to work elsewhere, and so want to rent their home out whilst they're out of the island. But that's only going to be for, say, for example, 2 years. Obviously, you can't offer an open-ended tenancy there, because then the landlord would then be in trouble when they came back to the island. So it's obvious that there ought to be an option there, that where certain criteria are met, you know, where there is evidence that there is a plan for a property, you know, you may want to rent a property out for a year whilst you work on getting planning permission to knock it down and build something else there, for example. What this will require is that there are reasons why the tenancy is not an open-ended tenancy, why it is a short hold tenancy. But what it means is that the open tenancy is the default rather than an option, because open-ended tenancies are currently an option. They're just not very common. What we're asking the housing minister to do is to go away, do that work and work out what are the circumstances where a tenancy would have to be a short hold one, and make sure that the landlord has the flexibility to be able to do that where it's appropriate. But where it is not appropriate to have short hold tenancies, where it is purely being used for convenience rather than to enable tenants to have decent security in their homes and to have the security that know that they can live there a long time, then that's presumed to be a default. So it swaps it round like that. But then that's detail that will come back later to the Assembly for approval and for tweaking as necessary, if members are of that view. So,
thank you.
Oh, okay, thank you, Deputy.
Very helpful.
So that's for Part A, and I think Part A goes hand in hand with Part B. I don't think they work well without each other, and I'll explain why in just a moment. But to sum up what Part B is about, Part B is about introducing rent stabilisation. And let's be clear, that is rent stabilisation, not rent control, not rent caps. They are a different thing. Members, I'm sure, will have views about rent control or rent caps, but please get that out of your mind. Rent stabilisation is a specific thing. And what it is that it's a prohibition on annual rent increases that exceed a particular index. And that index, we can decide what that index will be, but RPI is probably a good one to say that if you are in a tenancy where you have an annual rent review, you are not allowed to have a rent increase imposed on you that goes above and beyond inflation when it's completely unjustifiable. It very simply stops rents from rising in ways which cannot be justified, and which may be an exploitation of tenants who are stuck without alternative housing options, and rather than being able to negotiate with a landlord or say to them, no, what you're proposing is totally unfair, so I'm going to leave, if they're not in a position to be able to do that because they don't have the money to move, or because their children are at a school that they won't be able to get another home nearby, or that sort of thing, it stops them from having that potential exploitation put upon them, and ensures that when rents do go up, they're at a reasonable and justifiable level. And of course, that has to go hand in hand with a rent commission or a rent tribunal sort of thing, where when it's demonstrated that there are rent practices which are unfair, that tenants can challenge them. And that I suppose that would also work the other way round, you know, where what is the considered market rate for a property does go up because of something drastic the landlord has done to improve it, then having a reasonable review would seem sensible, and that can be dealt with by a rent tribunal to make sure that that's done properly. So of all the parts of this proposition, I suspect this is the one that probably makes some members feel most nervous about it. But I say they shouldn't feel nervous, because what I'm proposing and what the Housing Policy Development Board comprehensively looked into is already commonplace in parts of Europe. And actually, sir, guess what? It's already standard practice in Jersey for some truly good landlords, because we have a template tenancy agreement which is promoted by the government, which actually already features rent stabilisation. It's just a voluntary form of it. So if there are landlords out there now who have long-term tenants who they have a good relationship with, and they have a tenancy that abides by the template that's promoted by the government, then they already have rent stabilisation built into it. So those landlords actually don't have anything to fear from this change, because it's not going to change their situation. But the only ones who it will change are for those who want to implement rent increases which are unjustifiable. And I'd ask members not to side with the unjustifiable. So that's for private rental housing, and I think those two parts go together. And when it comes to it, I'll probably ask for the vote on those two to be taken together, because if you have rent stabilisation but you don't have open-ended tenancies, then what you'll get is continuation of short-hold tenancies, and landlords will just cancel or refuse to renew a tenancy at the end when they want a rent increase, rather than renew a tenancy on that basis, which will obviously provide less security for tenants who won't know that they've got a long time to establish themselves somewhere and make it their home. So I think those two need to go together. The next two parts also need to go together because they're the two parts of the proposition that deal with social rental housing. I say in the report to my proposition, sir, and I make no bones about this point, that if social housing rents are charged at 90% of the market rate, it's not social housing. I'm sorry, but it's just not. It doesn't fit the definition, and it's so close to market rate and that it may as well be market rate. And it doesn't even prevent tenants in social housing from being protected from rental stress levels. And in fact, sir, the last time this was measured, which was 6 years ago, so these figures are out of date and situations probably got worse since then, almost half of social housing tenants were living in rental stress, i.e. spending more than a third of their income on their housing costs. That defeats the point of social housing. The point of social housing, in our system at least, is to help people who are on lower incomes to have a decent standard of living when they would struggle in the private sector. Our system doesn't do that. It's broken. And the policy exists to this day for no good reason. It was a shoddy compromise in 2014 when it was first introduced, and to this day I can't detect any political support for maintaining the 90% rule. I can't, perhaps I'm wrong on this, but I haven't heard any states members say that they think the 90% rule is the optimum for Jersey, that it is philosophically consistent and it's the right thing to do. I don't detect any support for it when I speak to the housing providers themselves. So it's a political matter for us whether we choose to continue with it or scrap it and come up with something fairer. So 80%, which is what this proposition suggests changing to, is fairly standard across the UK for housing associations to charge. And in fact, sir, it's much closer to what Jersey's housing trusts already charge. Our housing trusts are, by the rules, allowed to charge up to 90% if they want to, and they would still qualify as social housing, but they choose not to. They choose not to because they don't need to, they can afford not to, and because it doesn't fit in with their ethos. So in that respect, sir, Andium Homes is an outlier in charging the highest rents of our social housing providers, and doing so not because they want to or because they see it as being within their ethos, but because the states required them to in 2014, even though there isn't really a sign that the states thinks that that's the right policy today. So Part A asks us to accept an up to 80% policy rather than an up to 90% policy. The Housing Minister refers in his plan to an ongoing review on social housing rents. So I attempted to do the exact same work when I was in ministerial office, and I can tell the new minister it's going to conclude that an 80% policy is the easiest and most sensible way forward. I can do that. I can tell him that up front. That's where it's going to go. His review is destined to go that way. I would happily put money on it because I've been there before and I've got the scars to prove it. Andium is capable of maintaining an 80% policy. It's the average rent they charge anyway. Their loans for their housing developments can be managed within this policy. They just need Treasury to play their part in ensuring that the financial return they provide to Treasury can be reduced in line with the income support payments that will be saved, and potentially some extra for those who don't have their entire rent paid by income support. And that's something that the minister can come back to us on and demonstrate exactly what that impact is on. And if it costs the states a little bit, well, I would say that it'd be a good use of our money, considering some of the rubbish we've been spending very large amounts of money on recently. And so that's where Part D to this proposition comes in. So that is to ensure that this is done properly with Treasury and that this isn't an attempt to reduce how much money Andium has to reinvest back into its housing stock, that they can have that managed properly with Treasury and not simply have Treasury require them to pay back the same amount of money to them, even though the income support bill will be going down as a result of this, because that would clearly be profiteering out of our social housing tenants and would clearly be wrong. And the final part of the proposition simply asks the Housing Minister to come back to the Assembly with the work that he'll have done as a result of this proposition for our final approval. So that's a quick summary of the basics of what I'm proposing, following the 2 years of the work the Housing Policy Development Board did to arrive at these policy proposals. Well, I remind members at this point, though, that if you have questions about what will be the fine detail of how some of these proposals will work in practice, you don't need to worry about it yet. You may legitimately ask about circumstances, and Deputy Morrell, in his point of clarification, made it clear that there are certainly questions to be asked on the detail of this. You may ask about circumstances where an open-ended tenancy is not appropriate, or where there are legitimate reasons that a landlord needs to take back possession of their property. But accepting this proposition does not tie our hands behind our back to avoid having to deal with this issue. There will still be consultation with stakeholders. There will still be rules that will need to be drawn up that this Assembly will have final approval over, or be able to tweak if necessary. I'm sure scrutiny will want to have a look at those when they come back to make sure that they're fit for purpose and that those specific circumstances are catered for. It's not a black and white issue, what's proposed, and nothing changes tomorrow. The only thing that changes tomorrow is that the minister will have the green light he needs to go and do that work, to consult with landlords and present back to the States members that final approval. So, sir, if you like the idea of what these proposals are getting at, greater security for tenants and protection from unjustifiable rent increases, as millions of people already benefit from throughout Europe, then you can safely vote in favour of this and know that it does not change anything tomorrow. It merely asks the government to do the work within the framework that they have already said that they're setting, and come back with an implementation plan, rather than what we risk at the moment, which is simply going over old ground, re-reviewing what has already been reviewed and going round in circles, which I don't think is a good use of our time. We have a housing crisis in Jersey. The people who we serve need us to take action. We will not be serving them well if we throw into the bin the work that has already taken a long time to produce, so that we can indulge ourselves with more talking, more reviews and more consultations. They deserve better than that. And it's on that basis, having been involved in the work of the Housing Policy Development Board for 2 years, for knowing that it's the right thing for Jersey to improve rental housing in the island in this way. I don't want to stand by and leave these issues hanging for longer than they need to. I make this proposition, sir, and I urge members to vote in favour of it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Deputy Martin, thank you for your email. I understand that you wish to declare an interest as an Andium tenant. This proposition does not directly affect Andium tenants, as it expresses an opinion about how rents should be set for the Minister to consider. In addition, there are a significant number of Andium tenants. Your interest is therefore an indirect financial interest in the terms of Standing Order 106. So you should and have declared it. There's no requirement for you to withdraw from the debate. In view of parts A and B of the proposition, all private landlords should now declare an interest in the chat on the same basis, an indirect financial interest that I can then read out, so that that those interests have been publicly declared. And the Conotab of St. 1 has declared an interest as a landlord. Senator Lafondre has declared an interest as a landlord. Deputy St. Martin has declared an interest as a landlord. Deputy Taddy has declared his partner is a landlord. Deputy of St. 1 has declared an interest as a landlord. So I mentioned Deputy Young has declared an interest as a landlord. Deputy St. Mary has declared interest as a landlord. The Deputy of St. Peter has declared an interest as a landlord. Deputy Guida has declared an interest as a landlord. The Conotab of St. Mary has declared an interest as a landlord. Deputy Pennell has declared an interest as a landlord. Deputy Truscott has declared an interest as a landlord. Senator Moore has declared an interest as a landlord. And the Deputy of Greville has declared an interest as a landlord. So there may be more declarations in the course of the debate. Does anyone wish to speak on the proposition?
I just wanted to thank you for your ruling, sir, but I'm still free to abstain if I want on that part, aren't I? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. That's your entitlement.
Sir, can I second the proposition? It hasn't.
Yes, so I was about to say the same thing. So.
Oh yes, thank you very much. The Conotab of St. Helier has declared an interest as a landlord. The proposition has been seconded. Does anyone wish to speak on the proposition? The Conotab of Greville has declared an interest as a landlord.
So are we still waiting for people to, at what point will the interest be ended? Do you know? Sorry.
I'm waiting for someone to indicate they wish to speak in the debate. Does any member wish to speak in this debate?
Oh.
Deputy Ash.
Thought I'd set the ball rolling. Thank you, sir. I'd like to make a general point to start off with, sir. I've often expressed in the Assembly my admiration for the advantages of having a party political system. However, it does have a downside, as we've seen in the last few days, where Reform have indulged in what can only be described as electioneering across every topic that anyone could care to mention. With just a year to go until the next election, it's of course likely this would occur. And in fairness, sir, within their limited abilities, they've conducted it in an organised and orchestrated fashion. It rather reminds me of the scene, I don't know if you're familiar with the film, Sir, Blazing Saddles, where the parish assembly get together and one after the other, they all have the same surname, which is Johnson. They stand up and go, I'd like to agree with what Olsen Johnson said. And we see this often with Reform, where one after the other gets up to agree with their statements. The problem, of course, sir, with this policy is in attempting to lure, shall I use that word? I will use that word, to lure the electorate into their lair with a selection of goodies. One can lose touch with the reality of whether these populist policies really benefit the people they should do, the people that they should be targeted at. I'm sure that they believe that they do. I think they're fairly honourable people. And of course, from their point of view, it's important that it is perceived that they will do so, and thus attract the media attention to their perceived social injustice cause. But we're here, sir, to deal with the facts. And the facts are these. If we vote to reduce Andium rents to 80%, those who are in the most need in our society, in Andium properties, will not benefit. There'll be a minority who will benefit, of course, sir, those who can afford to pay 90%, or perhaps even some of those who are there at the moment who could afford to pay 100%. They will be better off. As long, of course, sir, as they are Andium tenants. If they're private tenants, they will not be. They will receive no benefit from that move at all. And what will, of course, occur is the gap between a private tenant and an Andium tenant will further increase and place property that Andium possess under greater demand. It could, of course, be argued, sir, that by giving those that can afford it a form of rebate, because that's what it will amount to, they will then have more expendable money, and that will filter down into the economy. That may well be the case, and it may well be a reason for reducing to 80%. But it will not, as I say, help the people worse off. It also means that the taxpayer will be further asked to aid Andium away from their funding model, which was agreed by the Assembly. The funding model is disrupted, and I hope it wouldn't, but it's possible that it would jeopardize a program that has produced, in my opinion, some of the best quality social housing you will find anywhere. We should, of course, be ensuring that they receive all the financial aid possible and not attempting to reduce it with populist measures. All it will really mean, sir, in fact, is that those that are in most need are no better off, whilst those able to pay are enriched. It would, to put it in a tax situation, sir, it's like saying that we will cut income tax to 10% for everybody earning over £100,000 a year. Lovely for those that benefit from that, but does not help those in need at all. But it does, as I said, sir, you know, it plays well. Reform's mantra is to preach to us about poverty in Jersey and how we should alleviate it. This proposition does nothing to alleviate any poverty, although it will play well for them in the press. Thus, they use phrases like housing crisis, which are both emotive and misleading. We have an overheated property market, and we are badly in need of an increase in supply. The sooner, in my opinion, the better, sir. But it is not a crisis. A crisis is the poor of Calcutta, Soweto, and the favelas of Brazil. We, like many societies, do possess haves and have-nots, sir. But even that is relevant. I remember once Canon Nicholas France, the former head of the Catholic Church in Jersey, where he remarked after a congregation was massacred. I think it was in Somalia, although the exact location escapes me and is irrelevant. But he said that if you live in those sort of places where a gunman can come in and massacre a congregation, if you're away from that situation and you have enough food and water for your family, and you have shelter, and you have protection from those militias, then you are a very happy person. Yet I would venture to suggest, sir, that we all have that in Jersey. And most have much, much more than that. But we complain, sir, at our first world problems. If you want an example, sir, and let me provide an example. Ask yourself this: how many people in Soweto would be complaining about a new state-of-the-art hospital being built for their use? And how many stopping a road being built to access it? First world problems, sir. It is vital, sir, in debates like this, that we must not take our eyes off the fine place that Jersey is to live in. However difficult that may be sometimes to believe in this assembly or when reading letters in the JEP. This was and still is an island of opportunity. Many have arrived here more in hope than anything else, but have made a fine life for themselves and their families. One only has to look, sir, and we can see it every day. You can see it any time you walk along the road, at the businesses that now bear the names of those from Liverpool, Scotland, Ireland, Portugal, and Poland, to see how good the island has been to those willing to embrace it and accept the opportunity to advance oneself, and those opportunities, I hope, remain today. In conclusion, sir, we all wish to help those in financial hardship, especially those unable to help themselves. And I would suggest to the Assembly it is our foremost duty to do so. And it's also important that we, as an Assembly, start to build the necessary homes for islanders instead of talking about it and trying to put barriers in the path of development. However, sir, this proposition does not help those in financial hardship, and it does not remove any barriers. And for that reason, I cannot support it.
Thank you. A declaration of interest from the Deputy of Trinity as a landlord, and a point of order from Deputy Tellier. Deputy Tellier.
Thank you, sir. What I'd rather do is, I think I've asked to speak, and I think I'm next to speak. So if that's the case, sir, I'd rather not raise the point of order and address it in my speech.
Yes. In that case, please begin your speech.
Thanks, sir. And I do that because I'm mindful of that. I like it when a member speaks from the heart and lays down a challenge like Deputy Ash has. And I do like Deputy Ash personally. That's perhaps irrelevant to the debate. And I think we get on well and like to have political discussions. And I think this is the place to have that. What I do think is remarkable, sir, and the point of order was actually going to be, I just noticed he said something slightly unusual. He said that Reform Jersey are fairly honourable people. I'm not going to ask you to rule on that, sir, because I think it's important that we do have as much freedom of expression in this place as possible. But I do note that the normal term that is used in other parliaments and assemblies is to refer to people as either your honourable friend or the honourable gentleman or the honourable lady. I've never ever heard anyone referred to as the fairly honourable lady or the fairly honourable gentleman, and I think that qualification is perhaps deliberate, and I'll let members and the public make their own decisions on that. Now the point is that the accusation, I think, of electioneering is unfounded, because it's irrelevant whether or not this is being brought by a party member or not, because we are all in this place as politicians, and we are presumably all here to serve the wider public, and certainly to try and represent our constituents who have put us here. And what's the point in being in the Assembly and having that privilege and the honour to try and make the island a better place as we see it, whatever our particular policies and our ideologies and manifestos might be? That's exactly what we are all here to do. And so it's unfortunate that Deputy Ash is actually the one making this party political. And I think what's happened is that there are certain elements in this Assembly who are perhaps wanting to be a party, but they haven't quite got their act together because they're part of the disorganised right. And so they're preempting the fact that we sometimes win some propositions, like other members win propositions, and we don't question the motives of that. And I just simply put this to bed and say it can't be electioneering if we're doing this day in, day out from day one after the elections. It's simply, if fulfilling your manifesto promises and pledges is electioneering, then I think that's something we should all want to be guilty of, sir. The other thing that Deputy Ash seeks to do is to talk about other countries and use relativist arguments. He talked a lot about places in South America and in Africa. He talked about Soweto more recently towards the end of his speech. And yes, absolutely, it's true, we have a beautiful island. And interestingly, this morning, and this is absolutely true because I'm more than just a fairly honourable member, before I went out to walk my dog on the north coast, as I am now, it's a beautiful area. But I got a call from somebody, and I was going to use this anecdote, but I wasn't going to say where the person lived. But I will now, seeing as the representative of St. Clement, or one of them, has spoken about the problems in Africa and in Venezuela. I got a call from a parishioner in St. Clement who was so worried about her neighbours who have been living in their property for 7 years in their home, and they're about to get evicted with, it seems, about a week's notice. She said that they've been there for 7 years. So I quickly did the maths and figured out that it's 6 years. It's after the time when the residential tenancy law was kicked in. So that family should have a tenancy agreement in place. It's illegal for that not to be the case. She said they don't have a contract. They have got no agreement, and that the landlord is kicking her and her family out, the neighbours. And I said, well, look, I need more information about that, but it doesn't sound right. And if that's the case, that they're covered by the residential tenancy law, then I'm absolutely more than happy to help you. Now, I didn't say to her, unfortunately, you don't live in your problems, your neighbours' problems are not significant because they've got it much worse in Soweto and they've got it much worse in Venezuela. I said to her, because I've got an interest in housing issues, I said, I'll do my very best to help you. And she said, you know, I couldn't get hold of anyone else this morning. I've tried a few people. Should I try one of my St. Clement representatives? And I said, well, look, I'll see what I can do. And it may well be that I should refer this to Deputy Ash, seeing as it's in his constituency. But he'll probably just say to the person, tell them to belt up. This is just a first world problem. If they don't like it, they should perhaps move to Soweto or the favelas of Venezuela, even though Deputy Ash wasn't elected by the people of the favelas in Venezuela or those in Soweto. So I hope I've made the point forcefully enough and without being impolite, because I know that Deputy Ash is an honourable member of this assembly, sir. But some of the things he said, I don't think are necessarily that becoming or well thought through for an honourable member of this assembly. What Senator Mezek is asking for is entirely reasonable. It's something which I think he's thought about extensively, because he's had a starting position like me, which is to realise that we do have genuine problems in this island. And when people are living in relative poverty and having to spend so much money on rental accommodation, which isn't necessarily fit for purpose, and we've done the first part of that work yesterday in reaffirming our commitment to minimum standards, to having a licensing scheme and a landlord register. It seems to me that we also need to do the second part of that work, which looks at some way of stopping the rampant inflation that we have in the housing market, yes, but which affects rental homes for our citizens wherever they live in the island. And this isn't a class issue, incidentally, because, as I said yesterday, you may have landlords who live in the island who have one property as something they've inherited, and they might be renting that out. You might have what I would call commercial landlords, but they have family here who are younger, perhaps. They have older relatives who are renting. And the nature of our society and the way we are all intertwined means that we all know people who are in serious difficulty. And it's bad for society, but it's also bad for the economy if people don't have money left at the end of the week, let alone the end of the month, to spend in that local economy. And when we try and say to people, oh, you know, you need to buy local, you need to go into town, you need to buy fresh fish to support our local fishermen and to buy local, it's all very well saying that, but if people are forced to consume the lowest common denominator and import things at the very cheapest and buy the very cheapest food, even though it might not be the best for them, that's a societal problem. We all end up picking up the bill for that. So personally, you know, I've often thought that maybe we needed to be more radical when it comes to rents in Jersey. But I can see that it is a complex area, and I can see that actually rent stabilisation is a good step forward, because people need to know and need to be able to project for a few years ahead. And if you're likely to get kicked out of your accommodation because at some point the landlord thinks that they can make an extra 15% by giving it a lick of paint and then getting a new tenant in, you know, that might be a valid commercial decision to do, but it's very difficult to base social policy and social consequences that arise from that purely on free market thinking. And that's why I think we should be putting, you know, the kind of unfortunate party political comments aside that Deputy Ash has been making today. And I'm interested now. I noticed Senator Gorst, another member of the closet Conservative Party, is going to come and speak now, which is good. You know, he didn't get involved yesterday, and let's find out what the Tories in the island have got to offer when it comes to solving some of these social issues. But the truth is, we all know that housing affordability in the island is a real issue, and I don't think it's wrong to say that we have a housing crisis. And I think that when we start to engage with people on these kind of issues that really make a difference to their lives, the single biggest issue that I see on social media is to do with cost of housing, whether it's to be able to buy a house for the first time so you don't have to pay dead rent, or to be able to live somewhere, pay your rent and then still have something. Alexa, turn off. To have something at the, sorry about that, sir. I thought I was trying to mute my microphone there. And yeah, I think that's the point. If people don't have money in the end of their pockets at the end of the month, they're in real dire straits. And can I just say this? When it comes to housing affordability, and I think this is something which we probably all promote genuinely, is that we want people, if they want to be able to buy a house, we want them to be able to buy a house and live in it. And we have this cruel irony, which is heightened in Jersey, that if you can afford to pay rent in the island, even in social housing, I would suggest, you can afford to pay a mortgage. But the way our current system works is that the banks don't lend unless you've got some security. And so you get this irony where people are paying much more in terms of rents and than they would be in terms of mortgages. And the States really needs to think about that. I would suggest, this isn't policy on the hoof, but it's something that should be given serious consideration, is bringing back the States loan scheme for housing. How many of our families might have benefited from that in the past? And it's so marginal for people who, I spoke to one person, I'll make this my last comment, sir, a long-standing community worker in St. Brelard, who said there was a point at which we had to decide whether or not we were going to have children in Jersey or whether we're going to buy our home. And he jokingly said, I made the wrong decision. And I don't have my own home now. And he said, he did say he was joking, and he said, but unfortunately that means that when I retire, I'm going to have to leave the island because I won't be able to afford the rents, and I'll be much better off renting back in the south of the UK, even though Jersey's my home, even though I've served the community for the last 20 years, because I'll frankly be £600 worse off if I stay in Jersey. And you unfortunately can't argue with that kind of economic outlook. No amount of nice beaches and cliff paths will necessarily entice somebody to come back to stay living in Jersey in a one-bedroom bedsit in St Helier when they can get something so much more in another beautiful part of the British Isles. So that's not being ungrateful. It's just saying we are Jersey politicians who serve the Jersey public, and let's not make false comparisons with other places in the world where the situations are much more serious. And of course, we should continue to support those places in other parts of the world through the Overseas Aid Programme. And of course, I look forward to seeing Deputy Ash on one of the next marches, which is highlighting poverty in other parts of the world, maybe in Palestine or in certain parts of the world where there are unjust conflicts going on. So today we're talking about Jersey. Today we're talking about real people in real difficulty, and we're talking about what we can realistically do to help them. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy Tellier. Deputy Morell declares an interest as a private landlord. The next member to speak is Senator Gorst.
Thank you. So, sir, I start by making a declaration. I am also.
Your sound is not great, Senator Gorst. It's coming in and out.
I feared that might be the case, sir. If I switch my
We
camera
still
off.
can't really hear you. Ah, that's better.
Is that any better?
No, I think he needs to use a different computer. You have this there.
Yes. No, we can't really hear you at all.
Separate computer. So I withdraw my request to speak at this point in time.
Yes, perhaps you can address the Assembly later on in the debate when your problems have resolved themselves.
Thank you.
Does any other member wish to speak on this proposition? Yes, Deputy Lavey.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I've wasted no time in determining a positive way forward. The publication of my Creating Better Homes Action Plan last week sets out for public scrutiny the priorities I've identified, the issues I'll be working on, and the results I want to achieve. When members examine the detail of my report, they will see that it is based on establishing a much higher level of cooperation and communication between government and housing providers. that there is important and urgent work to be done to identify ways to encourage the supply of new homes, and that we need to find the right mechanisms to support both tenants and homeowners in finding the property they want at an affordable price. So I've set myself and my officers challenging timescales to address the issues we see in the current housing market. We need to establish stronger system leadership, increase supply and manage demand, provide rental choices for all, help local families to own a home, and while we're doing this, we must build sustainable communities, putting children first. The proposition before us suggests that to deal with the cost of housing, we should take some very specific actions in respect of the rights of private sector tenants, and that the social rent policy should be changed. These actions on their own will not deal with the multi-dimensional challenge of immense proportions and complexity before us. We'll come back to some specific issues with the individual. I will come back with some specific issues with the individual actions in P31, but in general terms, they do nothing to improve the supply of new homes, release sites for housing development, create a better relationship with housing providers. And until we address those issues, we will not solve our housing affordability challenges. That said, the rental market is an important part of the overall picture, and my action plan includes 5 key areas where I am taking action. A review of the rent policy for Andium is already underway. This will be finished and acted upon in the next few months. I'm looking to expand the eligibility rules to access social housing. At present, people aged under 50 without dependent children are not eligible for social housing. Work is already underway to see how we can expand these rules to make social housing more widely available. The legislation in Jersey to protect tenants needs an overhaul. I already have improvements identified. Some are easy, others require a more detailed attention. That work is ongoing. The 2021 government plan included a review of possible rent stabilisation measures, and this work has already started. Finally, I'll set out a framework to investigate the need for a social housing regulator. In each of these areas, detailed work is needed to understand the options available, consider the impact on tenants and landlords, identify the unintended consequences, and evaluate the wider impacts on the housing market as a whole. The complexities of housing policy are well described in the detailed and comprehensive report of the Housing Policy Development Board. Against this background of complexity, P31 asks members to endorse specific actions for implementation without a full examination of the range of options available or an understanding of the likely unintended consequences. So let's look at P31 and what the policy board says in a bit more detail. Part A of P31, legislation should be introduced to enhance security of tenure and tenants' rights to provide for open-ended tenancies as standard practice. The Housing Policy Development Board says in recommendation 1, security of tenure and tenants' rights should be enhanced by reviewing, amending or creating new legislation and enforcing changes made through a resourced programme. The board did not recommend open-ended tenancies as standard practice. It did envisage that lawyers and consultants would be needed to look at the current legislation and to identify how legislation should be amended. It suggested that 2 to 3 extra staff would be needed to maintain any new legislation. It identified a number of challenges to this policy, including less flexibility for landlords may mean they're unwilling to let their property and reduce supply on the market. May not be sufficient tenant demand or ability to commit for longer tenancies. There may be sectors where there is a need for short-term tenancies to ensure the sector works properly, for example, with seasonal workers, which requires legislation to consider these exceptions. My action plan states, in 3C, expand protections provided by the residential tenancy law. The residential tenancies law was introduced in 2011 to provide a set of legal rights to tenants occupying self-contained accommodation. While the law has created a useful protection in some areas, many categories of tenants are excluded from the law's provision. I have instructed officers within 14 days of taking office to examine the Residential Tenancy 2011 law, identify areas most in need of enhancement. Actions based on this initial review be set out in the Fair Rents Plan. Part A is not an endorsement of the Policy Board's recommendation. It asks members to specifically provide for open-ended tenancies as standard practice. This is not a recommendation of the HPDB, and there is no clear evidence within P31 to support it. Standard practice can be interpreted by the Minister after the Minister has gone out, done the extra work that is needed to make a workable system. So what is the point of the proposition if the Minister can interpret the words standard practice any way he likes? I have already committed to looking at this area. The policy board assumed that there would be significant extra work undertaken to identify the appropriate changes and then create an operational team to implement new legal provisions. It is premature to request members to take a decision on Part A before this work has been undertaken. Let's look at Part B. P31B, rent stabilisation legislation and a rent commission or board to monitor and decide on annual rent increases should be introduced. For B, Senator Mezek has adopted the wording of the Policy Board's recommendation, and he's quoted from sections 738 to 7323 of the report. In particular, at 7311, the board notes further research on key, turn my mic down a little bit. The board notes that further research on key policy areas is required, followed by legislation and the setting up of some form of board. This is not a recommendation to just get on with it. This is a recommendation from the board to do further policy work, understand the consequences better, get the right structures in place. This work is already underway via a government plan commitment, which states, we recognise the critical importance of improving the quality and affordability of housing for islanders. We will continue our important work, which we have already started on tenants' rights, including implementing a new housing advisory service and developing rent stabilisation measures. I can reassure members that voting against Part B will not stop the work that is already ongoing to look at rent stabilisation. The Creating Better Homes Action Plan says in 3D, protection from excessive rent rises. Jersey does have existing legislation in respect of rent increases in the private sector. The rent control law provides for a rent control tribunal. However, the tribunal is not currently constituted and this law is not in active use. An initial review will identify measures that could be used to provide tenants with appropriate protection from excessive rent rises. Actions based on this initial review will be set out in the Fair Rents Plan with deadlines for completion by 2022. But I can also assure members that when that work is complete, they will be given a full report setting out the implications for tenants, landlords, the housing market as a whole before agreeing to any new legislation. For example, the Housing Policy Report identifies two important risks associated with its recommendation. The quality of rental properties could decrease as landlords are disincentivized from investing in their properties. Hence, it is crucial that the rent stabilisation is moderate to retain a reasonable return for landlords. Property quality standards and having policy exceptions for improvement works also positively mitigates this risk. That's the Policy Development Board, and they go on to say, a significant risk is that rental growth becomes the norm, and therefore rent increases could occur where historically landlords have not uplifted rental values. I need to be given reassurances that any proposal that I bring forward has taken into account these risks and the overall benefit to the population. I have no intention of endorsing a decision based on a purely political point of view. As we move to Part C and D of P31, C, the social rent setting should be reduced from charging rents of up to 90% of the market rate to charging up to 80% of the market rate. And D, the annual financial return provided by Andium Homes to the Treasury should be amended by the Government Plan 2022-25 to enable this change in rents policy without negatively impacting on their housing development programme. The Housing Policy Development Board recommendation reads, the existing 90% social rents policy is considered too high and has potential adverse effects on tenants and the housing market. It should therefore be changed in order for social rents to be set and maintained at affordable levels for tenants, whilst taking into account the need to maintain a sustainable funding model for investment in social housing. P31 makes very specific proposals which are not included in the Policy Development Board report. Senator Messick's report again quotes at length from the Policy Board's report. It is clear from those quotes that the Policy Board did not have a clear view as to how the social rent policy should be changed. A range of options are set out, but no conclusion is reached. The overall recommendation also hedges its bets by both suggesting that rents should in some way be set at a lower level, while also acknowledging the need to maintain investment in social housing. The challenges set out by the board in respect of this recommendation include it would only benefit those social housing tenants who are able to access social housing and do not receive income support, which may be seen as unfair or poorly targeted. Requires a move to a capital subsidy model of social housing delivery, where the Government of Jersey would provide a genuine subsidy for new housing supply, as opposed to low-cost borrowing that has been an important factor in deciding the current 90% of market rate rent setting policy. In the absence of additional capital subsidies, this may increase the cost of borrowing to Andium. If the Government of Jersey bore the cost of the reduced income, it may lead to a reduction in states' revenues that could result in reduced expenditure in other areas or increased taxation. Would increase demand for social housing, as this would be significantly lower cost than renting in the market. Now, these are significant issues that are not discussed in the Senator's report. Part D of his proposition places the full cost of his proposal with the Treasury without consideration of the negative impacts and implications. This is a government plan commitment. Further proposals will be brought forward in 2021 to review the social housing rents policy, which will be accounted for in the next government plan. I have reiterated that commitment in my action plan as follows. 3A. The current States Assembly approved policy established in 2014 as part of the Housing Transformation Programme sets social rents at up to a maximum of 90% of market value. Excuse me. The policy ensures that Andium Homes has sufficient rental income to finance the much needed refurbishment and delivery programme that is still ongoing. The 2021 government plan includes a commitment that further proposals will be brought forward in 2021 to review the social housing rents policy, which will be accounted for in the next government plan. This review will be completed and acted upon during 2021, and the agreed actions will be set out in the Fair Rents Plan. Now look, my position has always been, since I was elected, in support of a reduction from 90% to 80%, and it remains my default position. But taking time to address the arguments that help could be better targeted, gain a full understanding of the impact and consequences as directed by the Policy Board is sensible. We'll do it over the next few months. It won't delay implementation. We've gone round and round in circles on this issue since Senator Valois brought her proposition to reduce the rents from 90% to 80% in 2013 or 14 and was lost by just 4 votes. As the Senator says herself, why is social rent policy tied to market rents in the first place? Is there not a way we can help those in socially rented housing who are also on the gateway to purchase, actually save for their deposit by saving a percentage of their rent for them? Is there scope for some level of government match fund? We have the opportunity to think outside the box, stop going around in circles, take a look at some new ideas and big ideas, and that's what I want to take the opportunity to do. So look, I haven't gone on the attack with Senator Messick. It's not my style. I've taken action to end the purchase of homes via share transfer so that the homes we build in Jersey are owned by those qualified to live in Jersey. I've taken action to accelerate the formation of a new housing strategy and regeneration team, and the team leader will be appointed within weeks. I've already started or am putting in place the reviews Senator Messick's own Housing Policy Development Board calls for. All of the above didn't need to wait for my arrival, but on arrival, I'm taking action. The Senator dismisses my action plan as mere talk. I am organising for all the main actors associated with housing in Jersey to talk to one another in the same room, listening and learning and sharing experience of how to meet the challenges we face, getting clear direction from a more coordinated and cohesive government who will also listen and learn. Senator Messick accuses me of lining the pockets of UK consultants. It's simply not true. It's not part of my action plan. The last housing minister to employ UK consultants, Altair, was Senator Messick for his policy development board. My hope is for the new housing strategy and regeneration team to negate the need to commission outside consultants. The most significant change we can make is within government's grasp. And that's to release earlier government-owned sites for housing development. We simply must do better on this. We have to change the culture. Property Holdings are working hard to help me do this, to the extent that I've pledged to get government-owned sites committed to housing by the end of this year. Some are ready now. Some will be not ready until, for example, the Lekenove School 2026. But we need certainty for our housing providers so that they can plan, get the difficult planning process that we know exists in Jersey completed, so that when those sites are available in 2025, 6, 7, 8, or whenever, that we are ready to go with a spade into the ground. That is the single biggest action to directly affect affordability, and I'm committed to it. And you know, all these criticism that I've received, I'm not averse to constructive criticism, but Senator Messick was in the job for 30 months. I've been in the job for 3 months, and I've got 12 months left. And I'm proud of my action plan, and I'm confident that by 2022, when I leave office, the public will be able to decide whether I've taken the appropriate action or not. All of the areas included in P31 are also included in my action plan. P31 asks members to take specific decisions without evidence, without understanding the full consequences, without identifying the resources needed to implement the decisions. This is not good government. Senator Messick said earlier this morning, oh, don't worry about the fine detail. This does not tie our hands. We still need consultation. We still need states debates. Just gives the minister the green light to do the work. No. This minister does not need a green light to do this work, and he has started already doing it with a clear plan and clear commitments. While I do agree with some of the principles that lie behind P31, members should not be asked to sign up to political positions without being given the full facts. As such, I ask members to reject each part of this proposition and allow me to get on with the job. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Senator Gorse declares an interest as a landlord, and there is a question for the Attorney General from Deputy Morell. Deputy Morell.
Thank you, sir. I was wondering if the Attorney General would be able to advise me and as such the Assembly as to the current status of the Dwelling Houses Rent Control Jersey Law 1946. The Minister for Housing just mentioned that the Rent Control Tribunal, which is prescribed in that law, is currently not constituted. My concern is that if the Dwelling Houses Rent Control Jersey Law 1946 is still a law in force, why is the Rent Control Tribunal not constituted? Or if the Attorney General could explain to me what law has been brought in to enable that to not be constituted as a legal fact. Similarly, that law asks for a register of rents, and I don't believe a register of rents is currently being kept. And so obviously we've had discussions about licenses recently, and I ask under what provisions are we able to not keep a register of rents? So if I could just ask for an explanation as to how that law is not being enforced or not being enacted by the government, and that would be useful, sir.
Attorney General.
So it's the Solicitor General.
We can't hear you, Mr. Solicitor, at the moment.
I apologise. I thought I'd switched my microphone on, but I hadn't. It's a very good question. The dwelling houses law, rent control law, is still the law. My research earlier this morning produced a proposition from 2009 in the Assembly, which records the fact that the tribunal had only made a decision, I think, once in the preceding 4 years, suggesting that this was evidence that, generally speaking, rents were working fairly in the island. The proposition then calls for a review of the law in this field, and I rather think that that was the beginning of a process that resulted in the residential tenancy law in 2011. As to why the tribunal, as I understand it, has fallen into disuse, the short answer is I don't know, other than that there doesn't appear to have been a sufficient need for it. The fact that it's fallen into disuse doesn't mean it's contrary to law. It simply means that it is not at the moment being used, even though the law provides for it. It's right that the requirement for a register appears still to be the law. I'm not aware of whether that register still is operative. If it's not, again, it's perhaps just looking at the law, not a case of not, as it were, complying with the law, but simply that it's there and it's not being used. Now, that doesn't sound very helpful in terms of answers, but it's somewhat of a mystery to me as to what really has become of the Rent Control Tribunal and the register. And I'm not sure the answer to that is a legal one so much as a factual one. I hope that that is to some extent a helpful answer.
Thank you, sir. If I may continue just to help my understanding, because the Article 3 of that law says, for the purposes of this law, the states shall appoint a tribunal to be called the Rent Control Tribunal, and so on. And so I would like to understand how, when the law, in my view, requires, through the word shall, appoint a tribunal, how the states are then able to not constitute that tribunal, because the law clearly calls for it to be the case. And when the Solicitor General says that it has fallen into disuse, in my mind, that is irrelevant, because the law demands that the Rent Control Tribunal exist. Would he be able to, and the same with register, would the Solicitor General be able to speak to that, sir, given that there's no superseding legislation to remove the requirement for a Rent Control Tribunal? Thank you, sir.
So yes, the deputy is right. Article 3 requires that the states shall appoint a tribunal to be called the Rent Control Tribunal. If that currently has not happened, then that law is not being observed. That, I think, is the short but only answer I can give.
May the Solicitor General please explain to me, upon what discretion is a law allowed not to be observed? So, because whilst I appreciate there are no, what's the word? There are no offences in this law with regard to not constituting that tribunal. Yeah, where is the discretion to not observe a law, sir?
I don't think it's a question of discretion, sir. The law, if it's not being observed, is not being observed. Laws do fall into disuse from time to time, but it's not a question of, I think, discretion. If the law is not being observed, well, challenges could be brought in a court of law, for example, possibly by way of judicial review as to why that law was not being observed. But I'm not sure that it's really a discretionary question. If that is the law is not being observed for whatever reason. That seems to me all I can really say.
Thank you, sir. So if a government chooses not to observe the law, then they have an absolute right to do that. Is that what the Solicitor General is saying?
I'm not saying they have an absolute right, sir, no, but if no one is challenging the fact that the law in this regard is not being observed, then no one is challenging it, and the non-observation of the law will continue until either someone decides it should be observed or until it's challenged in some way.
And is the only route to challenge via a judicial review, sir?
That may be, on the face of it, one way of challenge.
Apologies for continuing this, but may I ask what other routes to challenge there are, sir, in the Solicitor General's view?
Well, the only one I can think of it is by way of judicial review, obliging by an order of mandamus, I think it's called, that the law is observed by the appointment of a tribunal. I can't think of any other way of challenging it.
Thank you, sir.
Deputy Gita, you have a question as well for the Solicitor General.
Yes, please. This is Nick. Sorry, Deputy Morrell has a very interesting question there, and I'd like to approach it from a different side. What if somebody needed the tribunal? So a member of the public actually requests the use of the tribunal. For the states to not have appointed one is a small dereliction until it is needed. So what if that need actually arose?
Well, again, I think the only challenge would be through the courts to say this law is not being observed. I need recourse to the Rent Control Tribunal, and the states needs to do its duty in accordance with law and give me access to a properly formulated tribunal according to law. And that would again be a challenge by way, it seems to me, of judicial review.
Thank you.
Yes, one further question from Deputy Morrell.
May I ask, Solicitor General, sorry, in regard to this proposition, the proposition obviously asks for, sorry, I'm just trying to find it. The proposition in part 2 asks for the possibility of a rent control tribunal, rent stabilisation legislation, which is separate, and a rent commission or board to monitor and decide on annual rent increases should be introduced. Is it the Solicitor General's, how does the Solicitor General see that part B interacting with the 1946 law? Because in my view, part B is already satisfied partially in that there is legislation in place for a rent control tribunal, which in my view is a board to monitor and decide on annual rent increases. If you may explain in his view how part B of the proposition may interact with the 1946 law, that would be useful. Thank you, sir.
Yes, the 1946 law is very much focused on individual cases where an individual tenant can go to the Rent Control Tribunal to argue that in their particular case, the rent is not a fair market rent. As I understand Senator Mezek's proposition at B, he is talking about the creation of a policy board, which is a rather different creature, with a different function, which would be to set points of general principle on the appropriate levels of rent or annual rent increases across the sector. So they would be different things, and B would require to be created by a separate piece of legislation.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Solicitor. Conatable of St Saviour.
I'm here, sir. Sorry. Yes. A couple of things. Well, a few things actually. We need an immigration policy, something that's actually working. Otherwise, we are going to continue to chase our tails because everybody who's allowed in is going to require a home. And when I say a home, I mean a home. So we have to have, and I know they're trying to stop this, or they put things up to stop us from having one, but we have to have an immigration policy. Otherwise, we're going to continue to play catch up all the time. We have these reviews every 10 years and we're still playing catch up. It's ridiculous. And when we say affordable, affordable for whom? We have a lot of people who work in retail and hospitality, and we have a lot of people who work in finance. The people in retail and hospitality don't earn anything like the people in finance, and finance can buy any property, so it's affordable, but for whom? And I think the ordinary, and I'm not putting a disparity on anybody's job or anything, but everybody wants a home, and it has to be affordable. And affordable for whom? For the ordinary working class people. And I just think it's such a shame. And this is not a criticism to Senator Mezek. I don't always agree with everything he has and said, and he knows that, but I have a lot of respect for him, and he comes out with a lot of good ideas. But he was in housing. He's a senator. He was in with the in crowd. Why didn't he do something before? Why has he had to wait till he stepped aside and come to this with all criticism? And I just think that's such a shame. Grasset Park is social housing, and it's in St Saviour, and a lot of those properties have been sold off. And when I have asked why we are selling social housing, I've been told because they need things to be done. So it's cheaper to sell them and rebuild. What a load of rubbish. We are waiting so long for properties to be built. You cannot sell your social housing if you're not replacing them quick enough. And I just think it's such a shame. And as I say, it is not a criticism to Senator Mezek. He'll be surprised to hear it's not a criticism, because we don't, as I say, we don't always see eye to eye. But I have the greatest respect for him, because bless his heart, he does stick to his guns. But I don't know why he didn't work hard when he was in with the Council of Ministers, in with the in crowd, and push this through. And I just think it's such a shame. So we have to have affordable housing. We have to have housing for just about everybody, but we have to have an immigration policy. Otherwise, we are going to play catch up, and then we are going to have to reclaim land. And it's not on. We're 9 by 5. We're a tiny island. We are safe island, and everybody wants to come. Fantastic. But we have to have rules and regulations for the people that are here. Otherwise, the people that are here will not have a good standard of living, and their homes are just going to be out of the door. Everybody needs a green space. Everybody would like a garden. And once and for all, I can tell you, if they're going to have these houses, they are going to need primary schools. Take it from one who knows. I am fighting at this moment in time to have these homes not built in St Saviour, because we cannot take any more in this parish. And there are other parishes that could do with the homes and could do with the rates. St Saviour do not want any more homes, but everybody wants one. And where are you going to put them? But not in St Saviour. I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Conor Tarb of St John.
So the debate started with Deputy Ash telling us we don't have a crisis. The definition of crisis is a time of intense difficulty. I would hope that the Deputy would recognise that some islanders are indeed enduring a time of intense difficulty when it comes to their accommodation. So one thing that I've noticed in my very short time in the Assembly is that some members appear to be more concerned about who brings a proposition rather than the actual merits of the proposition being debated. I welcome the news that the Minister is going to look at expanding the rules for social housing, although I do worry about the potential impact on the availability in an already scarce market. Sir, by my calculation, the Minister has only been in post for 120 days, so I think he should be given more time to come forward with his own proposals. Sir, we need to fully understand the consequences of the changes proposed, and I look forward to the Minister coming back in short time with these new and big ideas. I'll also look forward to his support and that of my colleague from St Saviour to my proposed amendments to the Bridging Island plan to provide additional affordable step-down homes in St John. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Conatab. Conatab of St Mary.
Thank you, sir. This proposition mentions a housing crisis. This is not a new problem. We have had a housing crisis for many years, as long as I can remember. I started work as an apprentice carpenter on leaving school at 15, 57 years ago. We had a housing crisis then. There have been many attempts to address this during those years, yet we are still in the same position. Our problem is a simple one: people. We have too many of them, yet we need people, so we have to address their needs. We are not doing that, so we have created a crisis. The term affordable housing is the biggest nonsense term ever. It does not exist. It is well known that we need to provide more housing, both social, rented, and first-time buyer housing. And there are plans to do that. Unfortunately, we don't have the skilled tradespeople to allow that to happen. Our local builders are busy with maintaining the existing local market, and most have 2 years' work ahead. Therefore, a building program means that we need to import more tradespeople by poaching them from elsewhere. That means an incentive, normally more money. That also means higher building costs and more people to provide accommodation for. There are, of course, other ways to ease our housing problem. We need to change our method of build. We need to build flat pack housing, far cheaper than conventional build, more thermally efficient and faster to build and bring into service. The main advantage is it is produced off-site, either locally or off-island, eliminating the need to import more people. Unfortunately, this method of build is not suitable for all housing. It is good for first-time buyers' homes, which could be subject to conditions preventing speculation. A social rented market is vital to Jersey in order to satisfy the local demands. This type of housing is best produced in the conventional build. As a member of the Housing Policy Development Board, we have made recommendations which the new Minister for Housing is actually addressing. There is a time factor involved, but it is being attended to. This proposition is not required at this stage. I would like to put my faith in the new Minister for Housing to address the problem. At least allow him the chance to do so. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Conatab. Conatab of St One.
And thank you, sir. And I think that completes the set of Conatabs for the northwestern corner of the island. I think the first thing I'd like to address is the title of this proposition. And although, as will become evident in the speech, there's not much more of it than I really agree with, there's no doubt that the Senator has got the title entirely spot on. Jersey has a housing crisis, and it's not just in the rental sector, which is where his proposition largely addresses the issue, but it's also in the houses that people want to buy, the starter homes. And in that respect, I should like to commend the Environment Minister and the designers of the interim island plan, because that does go a long way towards addressing on the assumption that it gets through this assembly, goes a long way towards addressing the need for more homes in the island. Because like all crises, in a market is always driven by supply and demand. And in Jersey, we have a lot of people wanting houses, wanting accommodation, and we don't have the supply to meet that demand. And the real way to address the problem is, and we have to, despite the fact that we're waiting for the population policy, and I know the Deputy St Peter's working hard on that, we do not yet have a population policy. But in many ways, that's irrelevant because the people that are wanting houses are here already, and they need houses now. So moving to the matter in hand, I was very pleased to follow the new housing minister. He and I have crossed swords at times over reform of the states, and I know him to be a very eloquent and thorough speaker. But I would like to express my support for him and for the actions that he's taking, because it's quite clear to me that he is fully aware that there is a housing crisis, and boy, has he had his skates on in the first few months and weeks of his office, because despite the adverse publicity from some quarters about his Creating Better Homes and Action Plan when it came out, having now read it and studied it, it seems to me that it addresses the issues very thoroughly, and there's no doubt from his speech that he's getting on with getting things done and addressing those issues and bringing things to fruition. And in my view, I think we need to give the new housing minister our full support. He clearly has a grip on the matter, and I think we need to allow him to do what he has set out in his speech to do. And in that respect, I think this proposition is not helpful, and therefore I would urge members to support the new housing minister in his office and allow him to get on and do things the way he wants to, and as such to reject the proposition in front of us today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Conor. Deputy Ward.
Thank you, sir. I hope this hearing is okay. The reception is not good today, so I'm going to leave my camera off because I think it enables the bandwidth a little. So first of all, I would like to say that the proposition itself does not get in the way of anything that the new housing minister wants to do, and I believe it can be read as simply giving more power to his elbow to actually take action, and I think it needs to be read that way. So I think Deputy Teddy dealt with Deputy Lash's strange comments, but I would like to thank him again for mentioning reform. We're not paying him to advertise us, I just want to assure people, but I like the way he does point out the hard work that we consistently do and have done over the last 3 years to really build genuine and consensus politics across the Assembly, so it's a good one to do. And when he forms his party, I can give me the opportunity to use a Billy Bragg quote, sir, and say to him, yours is a land with a wall around it, mine is a faith in my fellow man. I'll add the word woman to that. But anyway, let's move on. So work has been done by the Housing Policy Board, and what happened, I believe, was that it was taken the request by the Chief Minister to develop this board and come up and do the work to come up with some solutions was undertaken, and it came up with actions which were then sat on for 6 months, it seems. Now, when the Senator Mezek brings forward and said, okay, let's get on with these actions, the Assembly seems to have a sort of a group think of, oh, well, let's let the minister get on with some more plans. So the actions that are taken or proposed in this proposition are very clear. And the action to move 80 to 80% rent is one of the most important that we can take. It's something that comes up on the electoral doorstep all of the time, not just at election time, but week on, week out when you speak to people. And so it was mentioned that this will not address the right people. So it's clear from briefings that we've had that actually the drop to 80% rent will affect 850 people directly by giving them a 10% cut in their rent. And those are people who are working and paying their rent full time in social housing. So they're not highly paid. They're the ones who will be addressed by this most effectively. It directly links to a common strategic policy of reducing income inequality. But yet again, the government and ministers are not willing to take action to address an action that will actually do something. I really believe that this is an opportunity, and I would like members to go and speak to those 850 working families who would see a benefit from this action and tell them, I'm sorry, you're not going to see the benefit from this action because we've got a longer term plan. We're not quite sure what it is yet. It's very complex, so complex actually to the fact that we can't come up with any detail yet, but we will come up with some detail even though it's complex, but we can't have this detail in this proposition because it's too complex overall. And it is those confused, delaying tactics that are getting us nowhere in this assembly. And it's one of the reasons people are looking at the States Assembly and saying nothing ever happens. And when somebody does bring this, what's the action that's taken? Well, first of all, we use it's coming from a certain group again. And could I just thank the Constable of St John for showing such sense in what he says, whether he agrees or not. And he did this yesterday, ask pertinent questions and get on with the job. And it's a pleasure to see. And it's exactly the sort of work across the Assembly that we need to see happening, regardless of whether you're in a party or not, but just for the actual thing that's going on. It's so important. And so, again, we will fail to take action if we don't take some action today. So social housing rent, it was mentioned, is one of the highest amongst social housing providers, Andean rent, sorry. It should not be the case. So the figure that was given was that this will cost the 80% drop. It will mean up to £2 million by 2025 drop in the submissions to the government. And then there was a link made to, that would mean a cut in services. So yesterday, I asked a question in the States Assembly of the Economic Affairs Minister and asked him what cuts in services came from the £10 million spend on the £100 card. And the answer was, well, there was no necessary for any cuts in services from that £10 million unfocused spend, so that everybody, regardless of their income, got that £100 to spend, much of which did not go into the local economy. So that was fine. It seems to me that you pays your money, and sometimes it's a lot of money, and you take your choice regarding the outcome. Now, that is inconsistent, sir. And it's that inconsistency of approach that exposes the lack of real action that comes from this government and the real lack of joined up thinking. This notion of electioneering, I mean, I don't know when election campaigns will start. Perhaps I don't know when the dates of the Meet the Ministers government-funded PR campaign are, but I imagine that's the date of their electioneering starts. It's not about electioneering, sir. This is about consistency of approach from day one. We have been pushing and pushing for changes to rents for so long, and we've got to a point where what we need now is a direct proposition to make this action happen, because there have been obstacles at every single part along the path to this. So the plan that's come forward has got words like examine, identify, plan, and so that's not good enough. We need to take action. The members of our society are desperate for action. And it's about demographics as well, sir. This addresses a demographic that is not just those who are at the lower end of our income scale, but those that we want to aspire. Those people that we say, you know, get your qualifications, get yourself a decent job, get an income, and then go out there in the wide world and really make a success for yourself. But so many young couples, young people, young families are trapped in this cycle of very high rents, not a single chance to get on a home of their own, which will have more security in. And this sort of open tendencies that we've been talking about will give them some security at least while they're in those homes and trying to bring their families up. A cut in social rent would mean that they would actually have more money to spend on their families, etc. So this makes sense. It's just a question of when this will happen. And so we could do this today, or we could wait another 6 months and then a plan will come, and I make a prediction think will happen before the next election, or there'll be a sudden change before the next election, because basically it's electioneering. So I think it's to say that what I want to know is, what is the direction of this? Is this a direct? Do we have a direction of ministers to officers and saying act on this? Or is it officers to ministers saying, actually, you can't act on this? Because it seems to me that that's what we've seen in the past. So I think I'm one in this assembly who's consistently tried to make change. And I would urge members who are worried that they might be pushing the minister too far, or saying let's give a little more faith in the minister. I say again, there is nothing in this proposition that stops the minister doing the work he wants to do now. All it says from this assembly is, yes, please get on with it, minister. And here's a mandate from this assembly to allow you to do it. We made a step forward yesterday. We can make a step forward today. And so I urge members to support this proposition. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Pinnell.
Thank you, sir. Is it appropriate, before I address the current proposition, just to correct a comment that Deputy Ward has just made about the Spends Local cards, please?
If it's relevant, yes.
I think it is, because he said that the cards cost a huge amount of money which we didn't have and weren't spent locally. That, I'm afraid, is incorrect. The card production, administration and distribution to all islanders cost just under £11 million. £10.8 million that we know of was spent in the local economy, therefore redeeming the cost. And it was an issue that a lot of people spent their £100 on something that cost a lot more. So I just wanted to make that clear, that it was spent in the local economy, because that was the whole idea. That was also, if I may carry on.
There's a point of clarification from Deputy Ward. Deputy Ward.
Thank you, sir. Can the minister clarify then that any reduction in rent would be spent in the local economy in a similar way?
That's not what I was saying, sir. It was specifically about the Spends Local cards that the deputy addressed, and I just wanted to clarify that what he said was not quite correct.
There's a point of order from Deputy Tellier. Deputy Tellier.
Thanks, sir. I don't need that anymore. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Deputy Pinnell.
Thank you, sir. I support the Housing Minister's Better Homes Action Plan and would like to take this opportunity to address specifically the issue of 80% rents covered in Part C and D of Senator Mezek's proposition. You will not be surprised to learn that as Minister for Treasury and Resources, I am a firm believer in the need for comprehensive and costed analysis before taking important decisions. Decisions such as those that would have a significant impact on the operations of an important state-owned company, or that would come with significant implications for public finances. The Housing Minister's Action Plan embraces the need for proper evaluations, will deliver the government plan commitments on social rents, and is entirely consistent with the intent of the Housing Policy Development Board, who I am certain would expect government to undertake a thorough analysis of the options and consequences surrounding any change to the current social rents policy. A policy, I would point out, that has allowed Andium to deliver a highly successful affordable housing delivery and refurbishment programme that is benefiting those islanders Senator Mezek claims to represent. It is therefore worrying that Senator Mezek, who himself was a member of the Housing Policy Development Board, is asking states members to reach significant decisions without the necessary evaluation and analysis of evidence. In the case of Part C of his proposition, the Senator clearly states in his report that it is a political position and one which rejects examination of the options. In my view, this is not what states members should reasonably expect of serious political discourse. The Council of Ministers' response to P31 Part C sets out some of the analysis that has been carried out to date. The forecast provided by Andium indicates a net cost to public finances of £2 million a year by 2025, with this figure rising to over £3 million a year by 2033. The analysis also shows that P31 Part C looks to be poorly targeted, benefiting only a small proportion of better off Andium tenants. Council of Ministers is right to state that this net reduction in income would place a strain on government finances at a time of unprecedented levels of borrowing. While Senator Mezek is entitled to suggest that the government should bear the cost of the lost income, What he should not do is put forward a proposition that fails to account for how the shortfall would be met. It may be that Senator Mezek simply does not know. Whilst I have chosen to focus on parts C and D of P31, given their relevance to my responsibilities as Treasury and Resources Minister, I would ask that States members reject P31 in its entirety, which as a whole suffers from the same basic problems I have referenced in relation to parts C and D. The Housing Minister should be allowed to get on and deliver the commitments in his action plan, which from what I can see are squarely focused on improving the housing market for islanders in a way I would have thought Senator Mezek would support. Thank you, sir.
There's a point of clarification, Deputy Pennell, from Senator Mezek. Senator Mezek?
Thank you, sir. The Minister referred to a £2 million that becomes £3 million by 2025, I think she said. Could she confirm whether that is taking into account a reduction in the bill for income support and whether it takes into account renegotiation of loan repayments over a longer period of time that Andium may seek to undertake?
It doesn't include the Andium renegotiation, but would be a general, obviously if it's £2 million and £3 million, it's not an exact science, but it's a general indication of what it would cost the Exchequer to do this.
Sorry, sir, just to be clear, is that taking into account the fact that the government would be spending less on income support?
It was taking into account the fact that it would be the it would not affect the people on income support whose rental is being paid already, and it's only this whole proposition would only affect those who are the better off tenants, as I said in my remarks.
So I'm sorry, but she hasn't addressed the clarification there. She was referring to that from the point of the tenants. My question is a clarification on the point of the Treasury. It may well be the case that the tenant doesn't feel the difference in the wooden dollars that get shifted from one pot to another if their rent is entirely paid by income support. But if rent is reduced, those who are claiming income support will claim less income support, which the government pays out. So the government will save money. She's referring to a £2 million cost that this would have to Andium. I'm asking, does that include the fact that the Treasury will be saving money on income support payments? That I think is a fundamental point there, because if it doesn't include that, then this 2 million figure is grossly overinflated, and she needs to be clear on that.
Deputy, can you provide clarification or not on that point?
I'm sorry, sir, this would require a second speech in order to do all this, so I will send the Senator an email of the clarification, because it's very detailed and would take some time to explain it all.
Thank you. Deputy Martin.
Thank you, sir. And I really do decide to speak in full support of the new Housing Minister. He came into the job, as he said, quite late in the day, and he got up and running. He noted the holes in the tenancy law on the 14th day of his tenure, and he's doing something about it, sir. And now I want to address the policy board's report. P31 does not reflect the report's finding. It picks up on specific aspects and then extends them beyond the recommendations that have been made. And he's trying, Senator Mezek is trying to tie the hands of the new minister into the ways he interprets it, or he thinks that we should interpret it. And it's not right, sir. There's clearly in the report from the policy board has no timetable. The report assumes significant extra work needed to develop proposals. And it does not set out clear plans for action. It sets out high level areas need for further work, all that the new housing minister has put into his action plan in his first 100 days. I've been on sort of a policy board with him and the environment minister, stroke planning minister, and we helped put this together. I never worked once, I don't think, with the last housing minister. Sorry, can you hear me? I'm getting a lot of echo here, sir.
We can hear you.
Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you. So what does the actually P31 actually do? It really does tie the first part of the proposition is about the open-ended tenancies as standard practice. And the senator was interrupted by Deputy Morell on this and came up with, well, if somebody was working here for a short time and their tenancy didn't need to be a long tenancy because they're going to go off to work somewhere else, and that would be an exception to the rule. So really and truthfully, he's asking for every tenancy to be an extended tenancy, an open-ended extended tenancy, sir. And I always think when you're sort of making policy and you've got to bring it to the states, you need to know that the effect you have today is not going to make things worse. And the senator doesn't know that. He doesn't know how many landlords. I think there is a similar scheme in the UK and people can't get their tenants out, and they are bitten once and they are never not shy, so they just do not go back. They do the house up and they sell it after they get rid of the tenant. It is what it is, sir. When Deputy Ward spoke, he said about the if we have to put 2 or 3 million subsidy from the taxpayer into Andium to keep them where they are, it's liking it to the one-off payment of the spend local cards. They're two different things. One was a one-off. This would be in perpetuity, so it would just keep going and going, and not knowing that they are directing it again at the right people. He also said, and he's probably heard this from Senator Messick, because we've always said it, is this minister telling officers or officers telling the minister what he can and can't do? Well, I think you've all met Deputy Labby, who is now the new housing minister. Nobody tells him what to do. He's put a plan of action in the first 100 days. He's put people around it. He's got outcomes in the creating better homes. There's a timetable at the end of everything. So I really, I'm probably not as kind as the new housing minister, but he is doing action. It's not a plan of inaction. It will be done, and we want to work together with him and make sure it's done. I do urge members today, read very carefully what is in those points. As I say, I'm conflicted. I won't be voting for C or D because the deputy wants to take them together. But everything else there, they do hang together. They tie the housing minister's hands. They tie the council minister's hands. They tie the treasury minister's hands because it's money. And again, I'm not sure, and I don't think the senator's sure, who's brought this, if it will have the right effect. And that is just a little bit more of information that the housing minister needs going forward. To address, I do understand where the Councillor Wilson Saver is coming from, but it does say we need to improve supply and then tackle demand. And we do have an immigration policy coming. We're probably going to see less people here this year because of Brexit. We know businesses are crying out for workers, but look, you can't have everything. So we can address the population. It's the nearest I've ever got to seeing something concrete in 21 years, and we're going with it, but you've got to take the Assembly with you. Sir, this minister is a leader. This minister wants to lead us and he wants to tackle the housing crisis. He doesn't need his hands tied by Senator Messick, who, as this Councillor Wilson Saver eloquently put, did the job for 3 years and produced nil. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy of St Peter.
Thank you very much, sir. I'd like to really applaud the Housing Minister for what he's achieved in 120 days in his Better Homes Action Plan. I'll give it an A, even approaching an A star, which is a good score from me. What I really liked in his speech was he's mentioning the consequences of actions on more than one occasion. Now, we don't have a crystal ball, and I'm going to be challenged by many people for the next statement. But I'm not asking to listen to me. I'm asking for evidence to be sought to validate what I believe to be happening. And that is landlords are selling. Why are they selling? We need to understand. Who is buying? If a landlord is selling to another landlord, then that's fine. The stock stays neutral. But are they selling to homeowners? Which is good news, because that alleviates pressure in that part of the market. But I believe a lot of the properties are not being sold to new landlords, hence reducing the stock. And I think that is a contributory factor as to why rental prices are increasing exponentially at the moment. We need to understand that. And that is my question. And I believe that the Housing Minister will look into this in detail as one of the consequences of what is occurring at the moment. Unwittingly, I accept. The next area of unforeseen is anything happening. We're hearing the market of global taxation changes. There's rumours of interest rates increasing. All of these things will could increase mortgage rates. And that could lead into a situation of property prices not freezing, but potentially stopping. Now, most property crashes, so-called, tend to be neutral. They don't tend to reduce the value of properties, just a few of them are sold and more stay on the market unsold as people hold out for their value. However, if anybody wants me to bore them, I remember London in 1989, which was after the biggest crash of my memory, when negative equity was absolutely rife. And if you remember people literally throwing in the keys to their properties because they were being left with such negative equity, they never saw a way out of it. That is real, and that happens. Now, I hope it never happens here, because it will be there'll be a lot of things that will go wrong to make that happen. It will be the perfect storm. But it is one of the consequences that the Housing Minister, I know, will look into to ensure that his policies are fit and appropriate for all. I thank the Constable of St Saviour and the Constable of St Wands for talking about the population policy. I might be rather quiet recently, and that's because of the work I'm doing behind the scenes. However, early indications, a bit like the lottery, this isn't it? Early indications tell me that the two most important aspects of the population policy that I'm working on will be education, but primarily lifelong skills, and of course, housing. And that would be the absolute focus, because it is the crux of our challenge, the supply and demand of the people in the island we serve, and where they lay their heads at night, and that is fundamental. So I'm going to end there by saying great speech, great 120 days, Deputy Labby, and I'm for all of you, let him get on and do the job that he's very bravely taken on to do towards the end of a government term. Thank you, sir.
Deputy St Peter, the clarification is sought from Deputy Taddeo about some aspect of your speech. Deputy Taddeo.
Thank you, sir. So can I just confirm, I don't want to talk myself out of asking this clarification.
He's refused to clarify, Deputy Taddeo.
I'm playing tit for tat with him yesterday. Sorry, sir.
Are you going to?
It's only because, yeah,
No,
sorry,
thank
sir.
you, sir.
No, he's declined to.
I just wanted to, so I didn't, yeah, it's fine. It's just because the deputy hadn't spoken yesterday, that's the reason.
If he's declined to clarify
That's
anything,
fine. Thank you,
then
sir.
there's no point to raise because it won't be responded to. Deputy Young.
Thank you, sir. I don't think there's a member of the Assembly that doesn't recognise the desperate need that we have for housing in the island. I think, but for me, the test is, does this take us forward? Does this proposal improve the situation, or does it make it more doubtful or worse even? And so that's the way I'm judging and looking at this. I'm not at all interested in whether this comes from backbench members for the Reform Party or my colleague ministers. That's not the issue. The issue is, does this take us forward? And what we have, I think, is a set of specific proposals. And I think, from my point of view, I do worry about when a series of very specific points are presented as being a solution to what is a very big strategic issue that we've got to break. And I was a member of the Policy Development Board, and I think there was some excellent work done there. And I really do believe that our new housing minister has a track record of not sitting on his hands and not wasting time in unnecessary pieces of work. Just look at his record in sorting out the whole structure of our electoral system, where I remember he made those commitments and he's delivered them. And so he's just taken on this role. Now, looking at this proposal, there are some things I would have liked to seen in the action plan, but I'll deal with that in a moment. But just going to the specifics of the proposition, I seriously worry about unintended effects, because I do absolutely respect and recognise the sincerity of the proposer and the sincerity of party members, because there is real problems there. But the unintended effects could reduce the supply, because that's the overall position we need to do on housing. We need to increase the supply, absolutely imperative. And of course, and there's no question, we have a we have a large private rental sector, which we very much depend on. And there's no question that the law does need to be changed. There needs to be different options in there. And of course, but the idea, but a proposal that says the default
Deputy, you've frozen. Don't know if you can hear me. Your screen froze and we ceased to hear from you.
Yes, sorry, Sarah there. So proposition A provides for a continuing tenancy there automatically. And the proposer said that that would be the default, and that persons wishing to lease property for other reasons for shorter periods would have to demonstrate that. And I do ask, well, who will decide? Oh, what procedures are we going to, corporate bureaucracy are we going to require or for that? And so other jurisdictions have arrangements whereby fixed term tenancies go into periodic tenancies, and there are all sorts of, I don't think we have that in our law, and the housing minister has committed to doing that piece of work to give us a better options there. The issue of the rent stabilisation, of course, we've heard, I didn't know this, that the current rules are still there in the law, but they're not happening. Well, of course we do come across cases of crazy rents being produced, properties being rented for $5,000 a month. Where on earth did this come from? But, those are the rarity. I don't believe that's common. But again, what we do have to make sure things are better. And on the question of the 80% and 90%, I've always said I'd like to see the figures on this, the analysis of it. And I know that I've got, we begin to get a bit more clarity with the comments paper. But, originally, I thought, well, what's the point of this wooden dollars? Sorry, the money go round of wooden dollars between subsidies from Social Security being paid over to rents that then come to the Treasury back again. But I can see what it does do. It has ended up enabling a very, very decent level of capital investment in our public and the estate. So that has done that. Also, I think it does address a situation where you have Andean tenants who are well off. because they make a better contribution. And I do think system does need to provide some sort of incentives there for people that don't need to occupy social housing in the longer run, for those to be released into the wider market. So now I don't have a problem if we had a policy that says we need to provide more capital into the market, because I think those are some of the views I've heard expressed. Well, it's going to cost us. I don't particularly care about that. It's a question of whether it helps, and it doesn't affect other housing trusts who have the proposition doesn't affect those that are charged less than 90%, doesn't affect the private tenants. What it would affect, the better off tenants would be better, in Andium would be better off. And so it's got all these kind of complications of unintended effects. And so I really worry about binding ourselves to that. What I would personally want to see, my colleague ministers know this, and so does the housing minister, he's had to be very practical and accept what can be done in the remaining period, which is only of the council of a year. I want to see, I've always wanted to see, and the words taken out of the housing policy development board, greater intervention in the housing market. And by that I mean procuring sites for development for affordable homes and social rented housing, acquiring them, the government to acquire those sites and then hand them over for development, taking out the high costs of alternative land values. Because at the moment, what Andium say is they're having to compete for every site that comes up in the market with private developers. And so what do we get? We don't get affordable homes. So at the moment, what we get is affordable homes on our own sites only. And, I really believe, Deputy Labby was very clear. He will drive that system. He's not going to let the regeneration steering group get away with just avoiding this. He's going to focus on it and deliver those sites. I trust him. But that's not enough. Back in the 90s, the government had a strong policy of acquiring privately owned sites. Just a couple, I recall, LaCoy, Ritz and so on. There was loads of them. And take them out, take out their high cost alternative value, develop them as social housing. And that was done very successfully. And that required us what? We had to raise capital. We had capital to do it. And then, of course, I can hear people saying, oh, that's more capital, that's more capital. It's an investment. They are homes in perpetuity. That's what I wanted to see by greater intervention. Now, that I think is going to have to happen. I would like the government to make a start, and I should be arguing with that in the government plan for 22 onwards. Even though I shan't be standing again, I should be arguing for that so that successor ministers have those tools in their bag to be able to intervene. We need that to make that investment. And also, absolutely, state's loan. Bring it back. The banks, Monty is right. The banks have failed us, absolutely failed us in all sorts of ways. Why can't some people right size in later years? Because they can't get loans, they're too old. Banks won't have it. Now this has got to stop. We have got to provide more flexibility, and so those people at the moment are driven to private loans paying 8, 9, even higher rates of interest. That's a ridiculous situation. So government really needs to do that. Now, all those are beyond our housing ministers, I think, capable. He just hasn't got the resources to be able to do that in 1 year. But what I do think we have to back him and deliver what he's able to do in the year. But I'm hoping that members will take note of what I'm saying. We can, as we come forward, we start to talk about government plans later in this year. We can put some meat on the bone so that in future years we can deliver the other interventions to be able to increase the supply, because it's only by increasing supply we will drive down the rental levels and end this. And also, if many of those homes could be done for affordable for sale, absolutely magic, because the escalation of property values for ordinary 3-bedroom homes is embarrassing. It is just, how have we allowed it to happen? And we've allowed it to happen because we've relied entirely on the private sector, and we have not enabled supply. And that's why I, as Environment Minister, was prepared to go along with zoning land to make a contribution. But it's not the whole story. I don't want to be zoning greenfields, but we have to face the reality of what we've done by failing to control our population. We need to provide that housing. But please, with that sort of speech, though, I shall not be supporting this. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the very sincere proposers. I absolutely understand that, but there is always such, we've got to have action. But I ask, is any action the right action? I think Deputy Martin is actually right to apply that test. And that's why I'm sorry, but I'm not going to be able to support this proposition. There's too many unintended effects. I believe the Minister will check those out, and we'll come back and we'll deal with and make sure that what we can do really does work. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Morell.
Thank you, sir. And I'd like to thank Senator Mezek for bringing an interesting proposition, and one that is forcing us, quite rightly, to debate the island's key issue. And we've heard all sorts of angles on this, from population, from the Contav Saint-Sauveur, to issues about supply of housing, and obviously rent stabilisation and levels of rent. So the debate itself is useful and a good debate. I have sympathy with certain parts of this proposition, some more than others. Parts A and B are probably where I have most difficulty, and primarily because there's such a lack of detail around it, but also, which I'm not going to push that because it's difficult to get the balance between detail and allowing the government the room to bring forward regulations that work. So I understand that, but it's also this idea that, as we confirmed earlier, it is currently the law that there is a rent tribunal, and there should be one in Jersey. It's a failure of government, this government, the previous government, and whenever it stopped constituting that board, which we think perhaps was around 2005, it's a failure of governments to ensure that that board exists. I believe that failure should be corrected. And I think personally that is one, the law is there, and it is a better way because it's not a sledgehammer to crack a nut position, which I think Part B really is, where we talk about a rent commission or board to decide on annual rent increases. I don't feel that that is viable, to have one overall annual rent increase kind of being set by one board. I think it is better to look at individuals, but make sure that those individuals are able to bring their cases to a rents tribunal easily, and that it's signposted easily, that the government doesn't just make it disappear without anyone really knowing that it's disappeared. So I'm not sure about parts A and B. Parts C and D, I have enormous sympathy with, and I'll explain why. And we'll start with part D, the annual financial return provided by Andium Homes to the Treasury. I think personally this is a quiet scandal that Jersey has been ignoring for years and years, and I'll say why. Currently, Andium Homes returns just shy, or according to the 2019 accounts, returns just shy of £30 million a year to the Treasury. I'll put that in context by using SOJDC, which is, I know, a different beast. It is a developer. It doesn't have the annual income kind of guarantees that Andium does. But in its entire history, going back to 1996, as the Waterfront Enterprise Board, and discounting the assets it currently has in terms of just ownership, SOJDC has returned £31 million in forms of cash in dividends and asset transfers, infrastructure improvements, things like this, since 1996 to 2019. £31 million from SOJDC. That's what it's managed to do. And I'm sure it's made its best efforts to maximise that amount in, what is that, 25 years. Andium Homes is expected to return that every single year. Absolutely. There you go. And I just find that startling, that one company is expected to return the same amount as SOJDC's returned in its entire history. And okay, you could say, well, that's helping Treasury. It's getting £30 million a year. Well, that's effectively, let's face it, a tax on affordable housing tenants. That's the £30 million tax on affordable housing tenants in Jersey. But let's also look at that in the context of Andium Homes' accounts. So in 2019, Andium Homes took in rental income of just shy of £50 million a year. It then had costs before depreciation, etc., just basic costs, maintenance, so on, of approximately £15 million. So it then returned £30 million to the Treasury. It left Andium with £5 million, and then it has to have depreciation, etc., etc. So that figure then grows smaller. So Andium effectively is allowed by Treasury to retain a profit of £5 million a year, despite the fact that it actually makes a profit of £35 million a year. That is stopping Andium charging lower rents. Of course, Andium can't charge a lower rent than the 90%, because if it was to do so, it wouldn't be able to return £30 million a year to the Treasury. Or if it did, it wouldn't be able to develop its own sites. So for me, government, and particularly Treasury, is entirely responsible for Andium not being able to lower its rents. I just don't see it any other way. And so when I look at the proposition which says the annual financial return provided by Andium should be amended in the government plan to enable this change in rents policy, the only thing that upsets me, and I should have bought it myself as an amendment, is that we don't state how low that should go. I believe we should cut that by at least 15 or 20 million. That would then enable Andium to reinvest in housing. That would enable Andium to actually cut the price of its rent. And why do I think it's important that Andium cuts the price of its rent? Well, despite the comments of the economic advisor, who I appreciate has provided comments in good faith, and his comments are correct. Academically, they are correct. There is no link, theoretically, between the 90% rate, the low market value rate that 10% below market value rate that Andium Homes are meant to be charging, and the private sector. There is theoretically no link. But when you look at the actual rents that Andium charge, and I raised this when I was a member of the Environment, Housing and Infrastructure panel, they are barely 90% of market rate. I challenge, and I've said this in scrutiny panel hearings, they look like they are actually driving the market rate. And I asked about the mechanism for deciding when Senator Mezek was minister. I asked about how's this market rate set? He never got a really clear answer. And as I understand it, actually, the market rate is set by a few estate agents coming up with a market rate and then telling Andium this is the market rate, averaging their free valuations and sending it. That's an unbelievably poor tool for deciding the market rate, and it needs to change. And that should be something that's down on the current Minister for Housing's action plan, is actually getting a scientific way of determining market rate, not just by having a few estate agents chuck in a few figures and determining it that way. And so basically, this is a long way of me saying, I believe that Andium unwittingly are driving the market rate for rent. And despite the economic advisor's perfectly reasonable theoretical thesis that there isn't a link between Andium's rates and the market rates, I actually believe there is, because you just need to go on Andium's website to look at the rates that for rent they are charging, and they are basically the same as the private sector. And in times, I believe they are higher than the private sector. And so I feel that Part C has merit, because I believe strongly that there is a link between the amount that Andium charge and the market rate that is possible in the private sector. So I do believe that if Andium were to reduce the amount that they charge, that the private sector would likely also see at least, if not a direct immediate reduction, then a stabilization. And of course, to enable that, you need Part D to happen, which is that Andium no longer returns £30 million a year to the Treasury. I'll repeat it. I think it's scandalous that we've all sat here allowing this to happen. We are taxing the poorest tenants in Jersey. And as a result of that, we are stopping or preventing Andium really getting on with the development scheme that works, that delivers houses quickly. And so that's where I have serious sympathy with this proposition. And I will continue to listen to the debate, but that's the area that if I'm going to support, I'm most likely to support. And I look forward to hearing other people and their thinking, but I'm trying to look at the figures. I hope I've helped the Assembly understand the figures. And, you know, I don't think it's fair that Andium have to make a return to the Treasury that is the same size return that SOJDC has made in its entire 25-year history, but they have to do it on an annual basis. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Chief Minister.
Thank you, sir. Actually, I'm quite pleased to follow the last two speakers, sir. Starting with Deputy Young, I agree very much with what he said, actually, but there are two particular points he made at the very beginning, which is he doesn't care where suggestions and solutions come from, i.e. whether it's a political party or an individual, a backbencher or a minister. It's about dealing with the issues, and I hope that's I'm in vehement agreement with him. And equally, I too also commend the work of the Policy Development Board. And so, sir, I hope to date I've always managed to keep the political issues separate from any views one might have on personalities. And I hope I do keep that in what I'm about to say, sir, because I generally do like Senator Messick and a whole range of all of our political colleagues, actually. But I did notice at his entrance, when he was doing his opening remarks, he made some comments around the delays in the Policy Development Board report being issued and all the rest of it. And I think it is reasonable to just address that fractionally, which is obviously the report was originally received. Then Senator Messick walked away from the situation, having declared his frustration and or lack of confidence in his colleagues. And obviously that does have consequences and it does cause delay. And frankly, sir, if we were all to walk away each time we got frustrated, I'm sure not only would ministers be in a permanent state of flux, but I'm sure actually there'd be many Assembly members if that kept applying. And I think the whole point around one learns from this is A, welcome to the world of politics, which is always full of frustration, and B, sir, it's also about overcoming those frustrations and finding solutions. And I do actually also then, moving away from that area, sir, but then heartily endorse the work of the Housing Minister, as in Deputy Russell Labby, because I think he has picked up what has always been a very difficult chalice. He's wrestled with it. He's wrestled it to the ground within his first, whether it's 100 or 120 days, I'm not too sure, but he has produced an action plan. He's getting control of it, and he's coming into it with all of his enthusiasm and energy that we would expect from him. And I think I definitely, absolutely commend the work he was doing there, sir. I think the other comparison, sir, is that a number of these things have been very, very long-standing and difficult issues to deal with. So I look at the population policy, which obviously started at similar times under the former Constable St John, who did very commendable work, significant data gathering, significant engagement with stakeholders. The reins have been taken up very ably by the Deputy St Peter, who is owning it, sir, and is getting on and delivering. And obviously that's culminated in committee debates. It's the principles of better controls have been endorsed and agreed by this Assembly, and obviously further propositions will be coming back to this Assembly later this year. And population has been one of those areas which we've all been grappling with for years. And yet, and I hope, sir, that both this Council Ministers and this Assembly hopefully are cracking it this time around. And housing is that same territory, sir, but obviously it has taken longer to get to this point. Now, sir, to go to the actual proposition, and to go down just the points that are in there. Part A, which is about introducing legislation, and I know the Deputy Labby has addressed that in his report, and is basically saying that we are looking at certain things. It's included in the timetable within the action plan, and it's going to be covered in the parent plan, which will be published by the end of 2021. In other words, work is already happening in these areas. In terms of the areas I have to say I'm most concerned about, now the rent stabilisation idea, when I first heard about it, again has some attractions to it. But one has to look at two things, sir. One is the comments in page 8 of the report and proposition, which is saying that the board recommends that rent stabilisation should apply both between and during resident tenancies. And what that seems to imply, sir, is that there are essentially only controlled increases that can go down on a property, actually. Because to date, usually, quite often what happens, which I have no problem with, is that a lease is cost of living increases potentially, and sometimes there are not cost of living increases that take place in the period of that tenancy. But often there's some form of upgrade or adjustment, and it might be because there's been improvements or because, again, the market has changed when that tenant leaves before the new tenant comes in. This actually takes that away. So ultimately, and over a period of time, an existing property will be, which is potentially the same as a newly built property, will just fall away because of controls that we put in place, rather than because of market adjustments. But I think the most concerning part, if one looks at the wording on Part B, is that rent stabilisation legislation and a rent commission or board to monitor and decide on annual rent increases. What that is doing, sir, is putting, and I'm going to use these words, sir, is basically a Soviet-style centralised control over the entire rental market or accommodation market in the island. And so looking at the demise of the Soviet Union, that's not exactly an endorsement of that kind of control and how it works well. And frankly, sir, there would be huge unintended consequences, I think, from going down that line. I'm sure Senator Messick will address that in his summing up. Part C, sir, the social housing rent setting. Now, interesting enough, the argument between up to 90% and 80% is something I've taken great interest in, and I'll fully admit, as with a number of other members and ministers, I've been initially attracted by it. And as I've said previously, the up to 90% is absolutely solely down to me, where I brought an amendment because originally there was going to be an enforced policy in social rented housing that rents had to be at 90%. And there were all sorts of unintended consequences that arose from that. And whereas up to 90% gives flexibility between those providers of social housing, it gave control and therefore and it gave them essentially the ability to manage their own affairs. And I won't go into all the other unintended consequences that came out of that particular policy, and that was fundamentally endorsed by the Assembly. And so therefore, the whole point about being attractive, you know, I've been there. I do understand this area reasonably well, and it was attractive. But equally, sir, it's beholden on all of us to go away and get some evidence. And so essentially, we asked the chief economist for some evidence, and that has been, and some comments on what might happen. And that has been identified in the reports to P31. I think it is worth making the point, quoting from his observations at the very end. It says, this may result in a reduction in available land in properties, and therefore an increase in the number of prospective social housing tenants in the housing gateway waiting list. Those on the waiting list may therefore need to remain in unsuitable or more expensive private market rental properties for longer than they would under current arrangements. And if the members have read the rest of the report, they'll understand the rationale behind that. So again, sir, I think although superficially attractive, and I will fully admit that I was attracted to this, and I had those conversations with Senator Messick, when one actually looks through at the consequences of putting this policy in place, it is not attractive. It does not, the evidence does not back it up. And on that basis, the advice very much is not to be supporting it. So D, the annual financial return. Now, obviously that is Centre Mesic trying to be reasonable and financially sensible. However, again, unintended consequences. And to ensure obviously that we don't put the data just in the chat, the net financial implications are the £2 to £3 million. That is after income support. That's obviously what's been confirmed to us by officers. And obviously that is, I'm just trying to find the other comments, that's slightly at odds with the comment which implies, I don't have the words with me in hand, that there are either no or limited financial implications arising out of this, or actually that'll be something we'll sort out in the future. Well, as I said, if one's going to spend £2 to £3 million recurring, then I think we do actually need to know where that is being funded from. Whilst I have a degree of sympathy for what Deborah Morell has talked about, what I will say, it is a slightly more complicated picture, because obviously monies that in the past went into basically the state's coffers, if you like, from housing, were obviously then ultimately would have been reinvested in various elements of the capital programme, of which housing was a beneficiary over many, many years. When Andium itself was created, and obviously it was Andium who put the policy in for 90%, they were obviously given 4,500 homes, units, and that's a lot, I repeat, 4,500 for £0. So effectively, they are, they have a choice. They either make an annual return, which is what they do, or there has to be some recognition of the capital. And one way or another, I think he was right. It's always better. We'd prefer to be in a different place, but that's the reality of dealing with the state's budgets. But I have sympathy for what he's saying. But again, it's one of those longer term issues that one has to address. But and obviously, so part E will actually, if one looks in the action plan that the Housing Minister has produced, there is a timetable, and it's on page 9 of the published report. So with all that in mind, so although this proposition is superficially attractive, sir, there are an awful lot of reasons which some people have far more eloquently expressed than I have for not supporting this. And I do urge members not to support any part of it. We do know housing is one of those long-term difficult areas which I would suggest we have stepped forward to address. We have had delays through COVID, we know that. We've seen delays across the entire programme, but equally, sir, we are starting to address those. And equally also, sir, we have not done anything. We have started taking measures, whether it's through the island plan, whether it's through the office strategy, whether it is through the housing action plan, that are starting to put long-term improvements into either supply of housing or how overall we control it. And for that basis, I think Deputy Young summed it up, which let's let the Housing Minister get on, focus on his job, and come back during the course of this year in accordance with the plan that is laid before members. And on that basis, I do urge members to reject P31 in its entirety. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chief Minister. Does any other member wish to speak on this proposition? Deputy Gida.
So I'd like to have a different take on, a slightly different take on the last few speeches and answer a few questions that have been asked. One of the first one is this notion of how much money would actually, with this proposition, cost immediately to the Treasury, especially the 80% principle. So that's very simple. Basically, 90 to 80% is a 12% difference, and over the total return of Andium, that would be about £6 million. Of course, a lot of that is paid by income support, about 4 million. So you would still have a £2 million loss, and exactly as the Treasury Minister mentioned, a loss that would increase in the near future with the increase of the number of properties leased. So while the proposition mentions no direct financial impact, of course there is one, and it's £2 to £3 million a year. Talking still about the 80%, there are two main problems about it. One of the first problems was already talked about, but it needs mentioning again. This is a free gift to the fringe of people don't have their rent completely covered by income support. It's people that could actually switch to the open market. And what you're saying, no, stay here. We'll give you your rent for a little bit less money, and that's random. That is not. It's not borne by their situation. It's not. They haven't gone to Social Security to explain why this money was necessary. It's just a free gift. And frankly, if we do have £3 million to give, let's give them through income support. Let's go back to Social Security. Let's say have those 3 million and give them through income support to the people who actually need it, because you have all their data and you know exactly who needs this. So to just give money like that for free without a good reason is not a terribly good idea. One of the other problems with this is that we do have quite a lot of social housing in the island. We should have more, and we will have more, but it shouldn't be seen as an end in itself. Social housing is to help people who have difficulty finding a home, who don't have the right amount of money to be in the open market. If they happen to have the right amount of money to be in the open market, they should go to the open market. They shouldn't stay in social housing. And the problem with this difference in rent level is that if the next step is 20% more expensive by design, nobody's ever going to take it. You're going to be stuck in social housing for the rest of your life. So you're lucky enough to go on the gateway, get your first home when you're starting working. Then you make a very good living, but you can never get out of it and give it to somebody else who actually needs it, because you have that 20% jump to make to get onto the market. So the closest, especially considering the fact that we use income support and that the rent is paid by income support, the closest we are to the open market, the better. There should be a completely free flow. As soon as you don't need the support of the state, you go on your own, you're on the open market. So that's probably the major reason why this 90% going down to 80% and why not 50% later is a real problem. It just locks people into social housing. Now, Andium return. When Andium was created, it was given £800 million worth of property. It's still in their accounts. If you read the second page of the accounts, instead of getting stuck on the first one, you find it. It's there in the accounts. They were given £800 million. Now, last year, they returned 37 million to the states. That's 4.6%. That is exactly what a loan would have cost them. And in fact, the whole assets of Andium are £1 billion. The 200 million that they have borrowed cost them £4 million, 5%. In other words, they pay the states, the government, less for their money than they pay the banks, than they pay the lenders. And the best thing about this system is that from the beginning, Andium had to work in an open market. And what happens now is that the system that they have installed, that they work with, allows them to expand exponentially. If Andium could build 15,000 homes next year, they would, because their system allows them to borrow at 5% and pay this interest. So if they need another billion to build homes in the next 5 years, they can find it. Their system allows it. If we told them, here's 800 million for free, and you don't owe us anything, and just make it work like that, they would probably would have found enough money in the rent to pay for management, for repairs, but they would never have had this system where they can actually expand. So we put them in the best possible situation to grow independently from the states. Now, something about landlords. Everybody's noticed that there were 18 landlords in the assembly, 18 out of 49. This is not an exceptional number. 25% of the households in this island are landlords. 25%. And of course, they are, as a whole, the largest providers of home in the island. They provide 8,000 homes in the island. Now, in a place where obviously there aren't enough homes for everybody and the market is going crazy because of that, shouldn't we be grateful that there are people who are ready to put their money in homes rather than in Bitcoin so that other people can live in them? And shouldn't we be careful not to damage that investment to the point where it's not really good anymore? And one thing that is also very important, they are not institutional investors. It's not like we have a housing company with 5,000 homes in the island, like actually is the case in many other countries in the world. What we have here is individual families owning 1 or 2 additional homes. Somebody with a cottage that they rent, somebody with a couple of rooms on the second floor that they rent. Those are our landlords. And the problem with that is that they have individual circumstances. One of our own has their mother in a home and needs to pay for that home with the rent of her house. But that can change. That can change from one day to the next. What if his tenants were now locked in forever with an indefinite lease? What would happen? What happens if his mother gets out of the home or if she dies? What happens to that partial investment? He cannot then go and live in it. He needs to keep renting it forever, probably at a fixed price forever. So he cannot sell it either because now it's not worth anything to a potential investor. So we have to be very, very careful to not frighten all those individual investors, those 7,500 individual investors, not to frighten them out of the market. Yesterday's action was probably very, very good. I mean, I defer to the wisdom of the Assembly that they have taken the right decision, but that decision will cost us 200 homes. That decision will cost us 200 rented homes. I voted against it because I thought that was a very heavy price to pay. How many homes are we going to lose today if we vote for this? So I urge members not to vote for any of the points in this proposition. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Senator Boutwell.
Yes, thank you, sir. I'm going to be fairly or extremely brief. So I am absolutely clear that my position, I will be supporting the reduction down to the 80% rents policy, despite some of the arguments I've heard from other members so far as why I shouldn't. One of the reasons for that is it was very, very clear that I set out in my mandate when I stood for election that the minimum that I would go for would be a reduction down to 80%. But I also recognise, and it has been mentioned of me, sir, the issue of actually pegging it at a market rental policy. And Deputy Morel, I think, really touched the button about this merry-go-round of funding, which has been mentioned time and time again historically. And I was slightly disappointed with the Chief Minister's speech. And the reason why I say that is because I would ask him to go back and read the Hansard of the debate that we had on the Housing Transformation Programme and the amendments that we both brought. He brought the one about up to 90%, and myself, I tried to stop the 90% rents policy ever actually becoming a thing. The very basis of that policy was to support the whole change to the Housing Transformation Programme, but forgot and I think incorrectly to define what affordable housing was and to define what the expectations for social housing were. So, sir, I said I was going to be brief. I've been brief. I've made it absolutely clear, and I wanted to state that on record. But I think the work that the new housing minister is doing, I congratulate him, and I really do support him working extremely hard on this really important issue, even with the lack of power that he may have and the reliability he has on other ministers. And I'm here, if he needs somebody else to support and assist with any of the work, then I offer myself up, glutton for punishment, sir, to assist in any way that I can. Because this is a key issue. It is a hugely key issue that has been for a long time. And with the expertise and work that many of us have done historically on housing, I hope that we can all bring something to the table to get a modicum of degree of agreement about how we move these issues forward. So I've stated my position, I think, quite clearly, and therefore I will stop my speech. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator. Deputy Alves.
Thank you, sir. This has been an interesting debate so far, and I found myself agreeing quite a lot with what the constables have said this morning, especially around affordability. And I think the Constable of St John's definition of crisis was spot on, and I'd like to add my thanks to those of Deputy Ward's around his comments about propositions that are being brought forward by Reform Jersey. I'll also be addressing some of the quite frankly appalling comments made by Deputy Ash later on. I want to start off with one of the common criticisms that I've been hearing this morning about the proposer of this proposition, Senator Mezek, that he was in government, so why didn't he get anything done when he was in there? Why did he wait until now, etc. I think Senator Mezek has actually been very public about his difficulties in trying to get what he wanted through during his ministerial term. And I would also like to remind members that it wasn't Senator Mezek's idea to set up a policy board. It seems to be the way that the Chief Minister is doing things at the moment, and Senator Mezek simply complied with the Chief Minister's method in good faith that the work undertaken by that policy board would lead to action. I'm sure we've seen that policy boards are being set up for everything and anything at the moment. I want to pick up on a comment made by the Constable of St One when he described Deputy Labby as having had his skates on in the short time he has been in his role. Well, I'd like to say that Senator Mezek could have had his skates on and put his policies straight into place straight away, but he was met with obstacles, and instead he complied with the Chief Minister's request of setting up this policy board as a vehicle to achieve some of his policy objectives. And I do say some because I was on that board, and I know that the recommendations that came from that board were not everything the Senator would have liked, and that indeed us as a party would have liked as well. Deputy Labby was correct when he said that the policy board did employ expert advisors to help them with their work. And as a result, they produced a very comprehensive and evidenced report. It's all there in black and white for everybody to see. Now, many members have mentioned giving the Housing Minister time to come back with his policies to do the things he wants to do. Now, sir, I have nothing against the current Housing Minister. I admire him a lot, and I've worked extremely closely with him over the past 3 years, and I actually sympathise with him. It isn't an easy role that he's come into at quite a late stage. But, sir, I'd like to ask, what was the point of having the policy board and producing the report? How much more time do we want to give to get something done? This policy board work happened over 2 years. How much more time and money do we want to waste? We need to be realistic, sir. We've got 1 year left. Finally, sir, I'd like to address some of Deputy Ash's comments, some of which, I'll be honest, I did take offence to, especially suggesting that my party and I have limited abilities and that we don't deal with the facts. So, sir, let's look at the facts. Deputy Ash was on the Housing Policy Board as well. His comments this morning were not echoed during those meetings. He mentioned that what is being proposed here would not alleviate poverty. It goes some way to help, and it would reduce income inequality, which is a common strategic policy priority, which I have not seen much work on, if I'm frank. Deputy Ash also mentioned someone that's quite close to my heart, which is Monsignor Canon Nicholas France. And he mentioned something that he had said and related this back to first world problems. I'd like to remind the Deputy that Canon Francis signed my nomination form. And he did this because although Deputy Ash might view this as a first world problem and that we should be happy for what we have, this is not how Canon Francis envisioned his words being quoted and used. Because I can assure members that Canon Francis recognises and believes that we should never stop fighting for injustices, regardless of where we live. And so this isn't just about those coming to work and live in this island. I'd actually like to give a personal example to the Assembly. The wonderful world of Facebook actually brought up a memory and reminded me of a one-bedroom flat I rented 14 years ago in my district in St Mark's Road. 14 years ago, that flat was on the market for £600 per month. It had 2 parking spaces. It was a lovely place, probably the best place I've lived in until I bought my home. It came up on my memories because at the time I was looking for someone to take over my lease just before I left for university. Out of interest, I decided to put that £600 figure into the RPI calculator, which is on the Gov website, and I put the dates from when I put that post up to the current date. And according to that RPI calculator, there had been a 30.7% change over that time, which means that in theory, that flat should be on the market for approximately £790 per calendar month. Now, I saw that flat recently advertised for rent, sir, and it is on for over £1,100. And actually, a friend of mine ended up taking that lease on and renting that property, and they invited me in. And I can confidently say, sir, that there has not been significant works done to the inside to justify that uprate. What we're talking about, sir, is an almost 100% increase in rent when RPI has increased by 30%. So, sir, I'm sure I remember the Chief Minister saying that this was the year of action. And yet all I see again is more delaying tactics and more review and more investigation. So the public are fed up of it, and I'm sure many of the members here are fed up of it too, as am I. So I would urge members to support this proposition today. It's a proposition which is backed up by a report that took 2 years to produce, used expert advisors, and would finally get things moving in the right direction. If this isn't supported, I do hope that Deputy Labby doesn't suffer the same fate as Senator Mezek did, and that he is able to undertake the work, and that he doesn't then get that, and he does then get that work supported by the Council of Ministers. So, sir, I think the last thing I want to do is be back on those doorsteps next year saying the same thing I said 4 years ago about housing, because nothing has been done. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Doublé.
Thank you, sir. I'm pleased to follow the previous speaker. That was an excellent speech. And I want to thank Senator Mezek for this proposition, and in particular for the detailed report attached, which I found really interesting, and it answered many of the questions I had, and the level of detail was impressive. So thank you to the Senator for that. And I'm going to focus in actually mainly on the first point, because as always, I wanted to find some research to back up some of the points I wanted to make. And the points I wanted to make were around children and children's rights, because of course every child, the thing that every child shares in Jersey is that every child grows up in a home, and this proposition will, if it's passed, have a positive impact on some of the most vulnerable children in our island. So the first part there, which talks about security of tenure, and this is something to me as a homeowner myself. I'm very, very lucky to be a homeowner, and you know, worked very hard with my partner to save money to buy our home. But we are privileged to have been able to do that, and lots of families can't do that. And whether a child grows up with a family who own their own home or in a rental property, that child should have the security of being able to remain in their home for as long as possible. You know, home is the most fundamental thing in providing a stable upbringing to a child, and surely in terms of putting children first and children's rights, surely security is the very least that we can provide as a society. So children in Jersey usually attend school close to their home. That's the basis of our catchment system. And if they're forced to move home, they can be taken out of their community, and there is also the possibility that they would have to move school, especially so for lower income families who cannot afford a car. So if this happens to a child, it can affect their friendships and even their educational outcomes. But it doesn't just have an impact on children of school age. I looked into younger children as well, and members will not be surprised to hear actually that the most vulnerable children in this respect are actually those who are within their first 1001 days, so up till their second birthday. And one study I found stated that increased residential mobility in early life before age of 2 years was associated with increased internalizing behavior problems in children at age 9 years. And internalizing behavior problems are usually mental health issues like anxiety disorders or depression or PTSD or trauma-related disorders. So up to age 9 years, the impact can be felt. So these findings suggest that there is a sensitive period in early life in which frequent house moves, even in the absence of instability in other aspects of the home environment, it impacts adversely on mental health in later childhood. So I would urge members to consider this from the point of view of children in the light of this research evidence that I've presented, and to support this proposition. I will definitely be supporting the first part because of that evidence I've found, and the speeches I've heard today have persuaded me to support all of the proposition, and I urge members to do so today.
Thank you, Deputy. Does any member wish to speak? The adjournment has been proposed. Does any member or members agree with adjourning now?
Yes, sir.
Anyone against adjourning now? The States is adjourned until 2:15.